Hello there, everybody. Welcome back to Star Wars Lads for tonight's live stream and Q&A. This is Tuesday, November 19th, and we're going to be discussing all of the latest in Star Wars news as well as taking all of your user Q&A questions. We see a lot of them in the chat already. Last week we had a big show, lots of people sent in questions, so we're going to try to get through all of these as much as we can tonight. But thank you so much for sending them in already. If you're just joining right now, send them into the chat. We will try to get to everybody's questions and answer everything you guys would like to talk about. It is an ask us anything, so you don't have to necessarily send stuff that's specifically about Star Wars. I see some questions throughout the chat about some non-Star Wars things too, so if you guys would like to talk about non-Star Wars stuff, send it in to the chat. Again, super chat is prioritized, so if you send in a super chat, it will get answered first no matter what. If there's a super chat, even if we're on the hour and a half to 2 hour mark and we get a super chat, we will answer your question. Make sure we get through all our super chats first and then move on to the rest of the questions. And if you would like to join our Patreon or YouTube memberships, we do have lots of other perks you can have that will allow you to directly interact with us more so, get your questions answered and asked, do some extra live streams. There are a variety of things you are able to access on those platforms. So if you would like to send out or check out our Patreon and YouTube memberships, check that out and see if there's a tier that's right for you. Also, make sure you're liking the video. It really helps us out with the algorithm. It's one of the best ways to show your support right now. And if you are new, subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed tonight and are having fun talking Star Wars with us. All right, let's get into the first news topic because there has been a lot of news in the last couple weeks, whether it's been Skeleton Crew stuff like the new trailer that came out, or there's been the Simon Kinberg movie trilogy rumors on top of Rey's movie losing its writer. And what does that mean for all of that? Well, kind of in the same vein, this week we have even more news around these same topics: the Rey topic, the Skeleton Crew stuff, more Andor. So we're going to run down all that stuff. Nothing crazy in terms of news, but I do think this is the biggest and most important story out there this week. And that is the fact that Disney has officially removed the Star Wars 2026, December 2026 movie from their release calendar. This is not a shock whatsoever. We talked about it last, or maybe like a month ago, when we talked about Stephen Knight being removed, that this was supposed to be the Rey movie, even though Disney and Lucasfilm didn't say this is Rey movie coming out in December 2026. This was always supposed to be the release date for the Rey movie. The other movie that was supposed to come out in 2026 was supposed to be Dave Filoni's movie in May, and then that got replaced with another movie within the Mandalorian universe, and that is Mandalorian and Grogu. So that date holds, but this December 2026 window was supposed to be reserved for Rey. As all you know, her other three movies came out in December. So this was always the plan. And then Dawn of the Jedi was to come out in 2027 ish originally. Well, now there is no Star Wars movie coming out in December 2026. Sonic, but actually, good news though, it has been replaced by Ice Age 6. So, at least you get to see something. Uh, yeah, but Sonic, when you hear that they removed the Rey movie from December 2026, what are your thoughts? And do you think that this movie even comes out in 2027?
I mean, it is pretty ripe to do a 50th anniversary release, with the original film. I would think that'd be a good choice. I think the question does then become if, like what's been rumored, that they are trying to rework everything into not just a new Jedi Order film or an episode 10, 11, 12, or a new entire era that Rey gets to be like this Obi-Wan figure for. They obviously kind of want to go for that biggest film. And I feel like even if they do this Rey's New Jedi Order film as almost like a standalone sequel, or sorry, standalone prequel to episodes 10 to 12, is it enough to get people excited for a 50th anniversary? I'm not sure, but I think it's the day and age that we live in with Star Wars now that we don't necessarily have to go to bat and be crazy for that. I'm not sure if Secret Wars, I think is supposed to be in 2027. I know Doomsday is 2026, I believe. So I don't know if it's back to back years or not. So may not even be available, but it'll be interesting no matter what if they do something big for the original celebration of the first real blockbuster franchise. And yeah, I mean, I I'm not surprised. Honestly, I was never too excited about the prospect of having 2 Star Wars films. The nice
Mhm.
thing about TV shows is that animated or live action, have fun with it, but you're not, like, losing anything. You're like, "Okay, like, it's a fun show. It has some nice connections to other things," but it's not something that becomes like an event every single time to me. So I was like, "Alright, fine, you can have 3, 4 shows as long as there's just 1 movie," and then when they put 2, especially with Mandalorian Grogu kinda being brought into the forefront almost like it's a reworked season 4 and everything, it's like, okay." But May is tight, man. That there's Avengers Doomsday, there's a lot of things around that. 2026 after this back half of 2025 being such a strong or 2024 being such a strong year, and if 2025 is even comparably solid, 2026 is gonna be a year of giants duking it out, especially if like superhero
Yeah.
films, especially with DCU trying to get kicked off with Superman and everything. If that excitement really reinvigorates and gets us to like that second wave of superhero films, kind of like how cowboy films in the 60s kinda reinvented themselves with, like, the spaghetti westerns of the late 60s and then kinda going into more of the nuanced descriptions of the westerns that you get to see in the late 70s and all that. So
Yeah.
it's gonna be tough no matter what, they're gonna do here, but I think it was the right choice. I think it'll be what's best for Star Wars. It'll give the movies the event status that they deserve, and it'll allow Mandalorian Grogu to be like a nice, soft launch pad for what should hopefully be a real return to movies. I mean, like, that's what the MCU has done. They've had a couple of nice shows recently, like Agatha and all that, but it'll be nice to see Star Wars be like, "Yeah, shows are great or fun, interconnected. We can occasionally do like a finishing off film or some tie-in between all these interconnected TV shows like The Mandalorian, uh, related shows, the Mandoverse, but movies when they happen are big. They're redefine the next 5 to 10 years of Star Wars. They get people excited from all quadrants. Yeah, I think that's the right thing to do no matter what. So I'm gonna be positive about it. I think Ray is the right character to lead that. Of course, I want Finn back, John Boyega. I want Oscar Isaac back as Poe Dameron. I want the new characters to shine without, having to do so much sequel apologia. You can still do a crazy, crazy ton of fleshing out of the sequel era itself to let them have their time and then gradually get them into 10 years after and then eventually ease them into that next generation. There's so much that you can do here, and I hope that they really are making strong future-minded decisions with Dave Filoni as the CCO.
Yeah, I mean, I pretty much agree with most of what you said. It's not a surprise whatsoever. We've known this is coming even before Stephen Knight, right? Because we haven't, this movie has been supposed to go into production for at least a year, maybe longer, since the rumors of when it's going to start shooting have happened. And then you keep getting these interviews with Daisy Ridley saying, "Oh, I haven't read a script yet," or "I'm going to get an update soon." And that was even before the more positive stuff she's been spinning out recently, post Stephen Knight and all these other things. We just kept hearing that there wasn't much traction on this and there hasn't been much discussion. So even if they kept their writer, even if things weren't up in the air, I don't think this movie comes out next year, regardless of any of that stuff. Even if Stephen Knight's still on board, I don't think this movie comes out next year. So this was an inevitability. A lot of people are running with this, in the hater side of Star Wars YouTube, really going, "Oh, this is just a shock." I don't feel like this is a shock. Now, it doesn't make this any less, you know, of a bad look on their part because this is yet another movie that's not coming out or has a release date that doesn't fulfill its release date. So it is still a bad look, but this is not a surprise whatsoever. As the rap who originally reported this says, they still do have a release date for December 17th, 2027 for Star Wars. now, and that could become the Rey movie. That could become one of these 50 other movies they have announced. That could be Dawn of the Jedi. I think right now it's intended to be Dawn of the Jedi. James Mangold has so many projects announced. Like, I wouldn't be shocked if he moves on to another one. I know we did talk a few weeks ago about him saying, or it wasn't him, but it was his writing partner for Dawn of the Jedi saying, "Oh yeah, we're starting to work on it, and hopefully we start shooting sometime in 2025." That would put it on track for 2027. And if I had to guess right now, I do think it's gonna be Dawn of the Jedi. If that actually does come out, I would pick that over the Rey movie as the favorite to come out in 2027 still, just because if, like, our next story, we're gonna talk about is true, and there really are a bunch of things that they're discussing right now for Rey and for her possible future and what they're going to do to kinda create this post Rise of Skywalker Star Wars universe like originally we got in the EU with Bantam post Return of the Jedi, where you just throw in a bunch of stories out there and there's a lot of different conflicts, and maybe they're not all galactic scale, but they do have the same characters featuring the same similar conflicts. Then I would hope they would take the time necessary to start outlining and crafting which one comes first. How does this one connect to that one? Which one's a trilogy? Which one's a single movie? How does all that work? So if that's what they're doing behind the scenes, then yeah, if we still get a Star Wars movie in 2027, I would bet more money on it being Dawn of the Jedi than pretty much any other movie they've announced. But I still don't think that's a good bet. I'd still give Dawn of the Jedi maybe like a 40% chance that it comes out in 2027. And because we also have heard absolutely nothing about that movie other than the writer saying, "Oh yeah, we might shoot in 2025." Well, if they don't start shooting in 2025, it's not coming out in 2027. So yeah, we'll see where we go from there. But yeah, another disappointment, but not a surprising disappointment. But hopefully we start to hear some more good news, as it does seem like at least the the wheels are spinning towards getting some actual concrete plan going with Ray and the Ray character. And that does lead us into another story which I want to talk about, even though it's not really much of a story if you actually read it. But a lot of people have run with this, and it's that the Hollywood Reporter kind of put out kind of an opinion piece. It's based on a lot of the things we've seen recently, but it's an analysis, it's an opinion about where they think Star Wars is going based on all these rumors we've been hearing and a lot of the outlets are hearing. And that is that Rey is going to be the center of what they're planning as like kind of the foundation of Star Wars post the Rise of Skywalker. Now, there will still obviously be the Mandalorian stuff, which right now is their biggest moneymaker. I think it's their most bankable thing. That's the thing that they're going to put most of their resources into. But in terms of films, it's hard to argue with the fact that they've made 5 movies, 4 of them made $1 billion, and 3 of them starred Rey. She is your kind of quote unquote movie star of the Star Wars universe of the last 10 years. And so, Hollywood Reporter, they're arguing that because of all these projects in production, because of the way Lucasfilm views Rey, the way Kathleen Kennedy views Rey, they really would like to make Rey basically the Luke Skywalker, for lack of a better term, of this post Rise of Skywalker universe, as Luke was as the main character that kept everything glued together in the Bantam era with the original EU novels. And so there are a lot of projects currently in the works at Lucasfilm, a lot of things trying to be unified that might not have originally been unified around the character of Rey, her trajectory, the time gaps, all the different stuff. Sonic, when you hear all this, not that it's much of a surprise because we've been theorizing about this for years, maybe months. What do you think if Rey is in fact the character that they want to center the entirety of the like foundation of the cinematic post Rise of Skywalker part of Star Wars around?
I mean, I think it does make sense at the end of the day. That is the Star Wars that people still know best outside of Mandalorian season one. You could argue, and I wouldn't entirely disagree with you, that yeah, Mandalorian, especially with that gap from season 2 to 3, and all these other tie-in shows that didn't necessarily do super hot. Uh, yeah, season 3 wasn't the best for everybody, and it kind of dimmed a lot of the character progressions. I think if it had been like still a relatively muted reception, but people really loved where they took Grogu and Din instead of being like a little bit more mixed like they have been with season 3, I don't think we'd be even arguing what people are talking about. And like, yeah, let's be honest, Grogu's still selling at gangbusters. Everyone's dressing up as Din Djarin. Like that's all still happening. But if we are still talking about kids who grew up with Star Wars and got to see the completion of a story, whether or not they loved it, whether they hated it, whatever it may be, that is the sequel trilogy. We've had almost 10 years since that first film came out. I think we've already reached the 10-year mark of that teaser trailer of that was like 15 seconds black, but just like the shot of like Finn jumping up, Ray jumping onto a speeder on Jakku and all that. Like the nostalgia is starting to kick in. I think even if people don't love that entire story, I have seen people actually starting to reconsider it a lot more online. I've been seeing people talk about these characters, say like little girls who are into Star Wars still today, and have characters like Ahsoka and Bo-Katan, and still put up Rey there as the character that they want to follow and really see that journey. So it makes a lot of sense for me. I just hope that the way that they develop her story and the reasoning of using Kinberg and all these other stories to kind of flesh out, like you're kinda saying, do maybe like a Bantam-esque sort of way of fleshing out the character and making her almost like this overarching guardian of the story. I just hope that, bringing in these creators that have worked with some of the best early stuff of Disney canon is a means to, addressing the flaws of the sequels of like it not being really planned out. Like, yes, people could point out to artwork and say, like, oh, look, they had even in 2017 the plan of bringing Palpatine in, or like 2015 art concept art that looks pretty similar. Sure, that was all there. And I do think that there was like a general idea of doing something like that, but that doesn't necessarily mean it was hinted at or executed between each film and all that. That 1 year gap that is between episode 8 and 9, it has to do so much heavy lifting now, and we've only really got, like, what, Resistance Reborn out of that and the Allegiance comic, not much theater going on for it, so seeing, like, that new Kylo Ren comic, that's a big start, like, okay, now we can finally address some of these things. You need to flesh out a story that moving forward has structure, has a plan, is still open to change and flexibility, but has a general branching tree of where you want this character to end up at different ages, like at her 30s, at her 50s, at her 70s, or whatever it may be. You got to figure out that stuff. And then while you're building toward really fleshing out all that narrative, flesh out the stuff that's really still missing from that sequel era. Just do that right. Put some organization, put some structure. You don't have to retcon anything. You just have to recontextualize a lot of stars, and people will go with it. Even if the biggest haters want to disagree with that, there's so much between like episode 3 and 4 that still doesn't really make sense. Like, how does Leia remember her mother if she died during childbirth? Force memories. It's like, some things just don't line up perfectly. The kiss with her and Luke, like, come on. There was no planning about those little things, but you can recontextualize a lot of things and make it better. And that's what the Clone Wars proved to us. That's what I hope that we get to really see here with Rey and her story moving forward, and especially during the sequel era. Build up Finn as that Jedi character, giving them not giving her the entire brunt of that weight of like, okay, it's all or nothing on Rey, old, middle age, whatever it may be, right? That she has to be the one to fix everything. That then you start falling the same pit traps that Bantam era had, and a lot of the same issues that EU had with power scaling and making Luke a little bit less of a character and more of just like a nuclear warhead deterrent for a lot of conflicts. You gotta work that out too to keep her interesting, fresh at every point of her story. But if you bring in Finn as a real Jedi who's different and gets his own thing or works with Rey sometimes, not always, like, there's another one. You redeem that character that everyone feels has been underserved for sure, and definitely was the more interesting one on paper. Yeah, I think you'll be able to do quite a lot there. And lastly, I mean, no matter what you do with Rey as she's growing, as she's getting older in the big screen, let Luke have his academy and philosophies and exploration be slightly retcon where he's not simply saying that Jedi have to die. It's like, no, like everything that he's done has been complicated, hard, difficult. The farm boy has succeeded in ways that he didn't expect to, but the ways that he wanted to maybe didn't necessarily come to fruition. So maybe splinter groups that are like a Cal Kestis led group, or just a church of the Force, kind of like that we see in Lord Santeca's backstory and all that. Different Force groups that Luke so desperately wants people to follow him in some ways, but the Jedi Order, for the lack of a better term, doesn't entirely function the way he wants to, and maybe he's got a lot of ideological slants that cause interference with him and friction with different groups. Figure that out, make it less so that he failed and more that he didn't get that ideal image that he wanted, and then you can literally just bring out characters from there and be like, hey, here's Ray and this character that you got to see in this animated show or this book trilogy that everyone really liked talking about. It's so much potential to make Luke still have some really strong decades, honestly, of him being this incredible Jedi, incredibly influential, but not necessarily entirely successful at his academy in the way that he wished for.
And those are all fair points, and I agree. I don't want this to just be our replacement for Luke Skywalker, just in terms of like, hey, that's too complicated of a story to tell right now. We don't want to have to, broach the Legends version. We don't want to have to figure out, do we recast Mark Hamill? Do we tell it in books? Do we do this and that? Don't make this more important or a replacement for Luke, because obviously it's not going to go over well with fans. And I think that's a big thing for me when it comes to making Rey the center of the entire Star Wars universe. And again, she won't be like the only character, but still, if she is kind of the face of live action again, let's say Mandalorian and Grogu, it's kind of a one off, maybe a two-time film. You have a second movie or you have whatever. It keeps evolving, but ultimately that's going to have to wrap up. Eventually, it's going to wrap up, unless you age up Mandalorian, and now put him into the post sequel timeline with Rey in these movies, right? And that's something they absolutely could do if they want to synergize. Uh, but for better or worse, Rey is kind of a symbol of one of the most tumultuous times of the Star Wars fandom. Uh, does she deserve it? Not necessarily. Does that mean the character should never have another life again? Absolutely not. I'm a big proponent of the Rey movie. I think it needs to happen. They need to reclaim the sequels and reclaim this timeline. And I'm certainly by no means a Rey hater. But it is a huge bet to hedge to say we're going to now make like all these other movies that might have been about something else now also feature Rey or about Rey because of how controversial she is amongst the fandom. This is a fandom that has been, now over treated with Star Wars content, right? Back in the prequel days, doesn't matter if you hate the prequels, everybody still went to go see them because that was all you were getting from Star Wars. I think in today's context, you have the ability to skip a Rey movie if you hate Rey, because there's still more Star Wars coming out on Disney Plus or other Star Wars movies that come out. And I do think that could actually impact box office more than they're expecting. So that's an interesting thing to follow. If there are just adamant people who are just like, I'm never going to watch this, then that could really kill the whole thing before it gets going. And the last thing I want to see is another universe that Lucasfilm kind of starts and then backtracks on because it didn't make the money they wanted or people are upset about the plot. So I think from a business perspective, this is a massive risk. It's a much bigger risk than I think most people think. It's a much bigger risk than they at Lucasfilm think. I don't know what their thoughts are, but if their thoughts are Ray made $1 billion 3 times, let's make Ray movies. I don't think those two things correlate as much as the
Yeah.
fact that a Star Wars movie with a number on it might correlate with $1 billion. I don't think Ray specifically sells $1 billion movies. So that's a very difficult decision. And also, just as somebody who kind of has appreciated the direction they at least seem like they were going with Star Wars Celebration 2023, the idea of being able to get a lot of more one-off movies that went after different eras and different characters and different sides of the Star Wars universe. I don't necessarily want them to box themselves into now just we have two Star Wars universe sides of the Star Wars universe. You have Mandalorian and you have Rey. I don't want that to happen. I want there to be more new ideas, more fresh things that they do with Star Wars. Keep trying to find the next thing, find the next Mandalorian, find whatever you're looking for. So a part of me doesn't like the idea that Ray might be the center focus of all of these other movies that got announced. But the lore part of me, the fan who understands that the sequels are there for better or worse, they're always going to be there. You can't erase that. And I want that fleshed out. I want that added to. I want to fall in love with these characters like I kind of did when I first watched Force Awakens and then started to fall more out of love with a character like Rey by the time of Rise of Skywalker when they did change so many things about her so many times. I want all that stuff to be reclaimed because these are important characters to the foundation of the lore. And I don't want the lore to just be hanging there and then we just ignore that because it's controversial. I would like them to actually tackle the controversial subjects. I just don't know if making an entire universe around around a controversial subject is the best business model. But hey, if they're planning on it and they're working on it and they're actually trying to craft it, kudos to them for at least trying to reclaim some of this material because I do think there's a lot there. And as we've talked about and speculated so many times on these lives, there are plenty of rich story ideas there with the idea of Rey, now an adopted Skywalker, being a Palpatine, all those types of things that really should have come into play in The Rise of Skywalker. You can now tackle some of those. And how is she remembered across the galaxy? Is she remembered as a controversial figure? Do you kind of do a bloodline-esque story where people find out she's Palpatine and now like it ruins her stamp, it ruins her Jedi Order? How different is her Jedi Order being from, the blood of a dark, the ultimate evil, and the trying to be a part of the family of the good side? All those different things that really should have kind of been about Rey in the sequels if they had planned on her being a Palpatine the whole time. Now you can try to do those things. So there are interesting story ideas and plenty of cool things you can do with Rey. Hopefully they come up with those ideas and they do them. And we'll see that in the future. Let us know what you guys think about the Rey stories. We do have some comments about the Rey story. We'll answer these comments and then we're going to move on to our next story. And then we'll get back into your guys' comments and keep switching off between some of these smaller stories and your guys' comments. Critical Thinker says, I'm not sure how much they can salvage Luke's story since there's no major conflicts between Return of the Jedi and The Force Awakens and new canon. Well, I think, and then says there's no long war equivalent or anything. The bloodline implies Luke and his order are pretty much irrelevant, even 5 years after Force Awakens or before Force Awakens. So all of that has to be retconned for Luke to have a big sprawling order with masters like Kip and Corran before it fell apart. And I would prefer that approach. I'm just not sure if Disney will commit to doing that. Well, I think in general, when you look at the Star Wars canon, they are willing to retcon things, especially if it's from media or that's not film or TV. So they're plenty willing to do that. But I don't think the implications in books really matter for the overall storytelling when it comes to Star Wars canon. We've seen plenty of implications in books and stuff not really matter for directions they're going. Um, we have Shadow of the Sith, which obviously comes out. Bloodline is one of the earliest canon books. It came out before The Last Jedi and The Rise of Skywalker. So it doesn't really have much, I would say, sway on where the canon has gone post The Force Awakens. But when you have something like Shadow of the Sith, it does hint at that Luke is involved in more things, bigger things that could be galaxy altering. But you don't need galaxy altering. Like ultimately, the adventures of Kip Duron or something in Jedi Academy, those aren't necessarily galaxy altering. I mean, they are important. they're they're devastating, but they're not the Vong War. And I would agree, you can't have a Vong War in that timeline. But The Mandalorian is already setting up a conflict that's much bigger than anything that if you read Aftermath or any other early canon books, anything about Operation Cinder, all those original ideas around the fall of the Empire. The Mandalorian is basically retconning all of that and saying, well, yeah, that was for the main empire, and now we've got this Imperial remnant. So there are going to be workarounds no matter what. I think in terms of salvaging Luke's order, I think you can still clearly make him have all of these Jedi Masters. You can clearly make him have all of these different people involved in his order. You're just going to have to explain it away with the typical Star Wars retcon reason, which is the people weren't there when the order fell. They were off planet, they were in another galaxy, they were doing on some important mission behind the scenes. It's classic cliches, and yeah, they don't feel nice, but they can do it and still make interesting stories in those timelines, utilizing those characters, utilizing big important pieces of the lore to help build Luke up and actually make him a character worth knowing, while also delivering important things like, the Snoke of it all. How even more of Snoke's backstory, more of Snoke's origins. How did he separate from Palpatine? All those different things. You can still dive into a lot of those unanswered questions from the sequels while simultaneously making Luke important. He'll never be as important as he was in Legends. It's just a fact. It's not going to happen, but you can make him a way more important character now post Return of the Jedi than he has been so far in Star Wars canon.
Yeah, and I agree with a lot of that. I just think that critical thinker. I don't necessarily agree with what you're saying about like, oh, Ben Solo is super uninteresting versus Jason or Jaina or Anakin, and Luke training next generation of Skywalkers we had in the past can't really ever be as good as it was before. It's gonna be different. I don't think Disney came into this even with the best of intentions, even before we got Last Jedi and The Rise of Skywalker being like, Luke is gonna be involved with 5 consecutive wars, right? I know you bring up the Vong War, but honestly, that's a war that had trillions of deaths, trillions, right? Like entire planets, if not solar systems, were terraformed and completely ridden over. And within, like, I know you just said you finished like Darkness trilogy, and but like by the time you get to Legacy of the Force, nobody cares, right? It's like they hand wave that away, and they're going into another galactic civil war, which in no way can it be as big as a long war, but it has quite a few books and it's got some pretty pivotal things happening. And then you jump into Fate of the Jedi, which I don't necessarily love, but at least that's more on the outreaches of the story. It's not really tied into everything going on with the remnants of the New Republic during Galactic Alliance and yada 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 yada. So I mean, yes, Luke is big in New Jedi Order. That there's no one denying that, but he increasingly, like I said, just becomes a deterrent. He's not really someone who comes in and he's like, I'm gonna defeat and destroy everything. Yeah, sure, he does, but he's not necessarily on the front lines in the same way as he was during the Galactic Civil War or the New Jedi Order. And I mean, a lot of the early New Jedi Order is him like in Mara dealing with the pregnancy of Ben Skywalker, which is like that takes him out of action for a while. He's really hesitant about doing a lot of things. He lets his militant Jedi like Kip and everyone kind of do their own thing before he kind of comes in and is like, no, we have to be smarter and we can't just do my way or your way. We have to find a nice little balance. But yeah, I mean that's where I look at it. Again, I know what you're saying that you can't find Ben Solo as likable to an apprentice to Luke or Jason Jaina, but I again I can't say you're right or I can't say I'm right. We don't know yet, especially for Ben Solo. That's like a 30-year gap. We don't know Ben Solo like at all. What do we have from the guy? We have some comics just before he turns and just after he turns. The movies, that's it. So and the only mention and real moment of Ben Solo is when he's redeemed by the Force conjuring up a version of his father, and then him literally jumping onto that Sith statue on Exegol and going, "Ow." That's the only line he really has as a fully redeemed Ben Solo. So I don't know, and I don't think the point is to make him anywhere near as likable or Jason as Jaina. His mother literally quits her training because, "Hey, I have a fear that but if by the time I complete my training, my son will fall to the dark side and everything he'll die and all this stuff." It's gonna cloud no matter what that part of his journey. I just think that we have to let it play out. I don't know what to say because we don't know Ben Solo at all. All we know is that he's probably gonna be a pretty depressed kid at some point, especially in his teenage years, moving into his, what is it, early adulthood, and then the revelation of finding out basically through the Holo News, which is like space TMZ, that like, hey, your grandfather that everyone hid the details from isn't just Anakin Skywalker, he's also Darth Vader, which is like, that's gotta be a shock too to the system. So maybe he had an incredible 20 something years, and then he gets that news, and then it just shocks him and what was gnawing deep in him, just in the same way that Anakin Solo was reckoning with the legacy of being named after Anakin and actually knowing that his grandfather was Darth Vader at some point. Yeah, I don't know. I can't I can't say I really know what to, argue about here. I'll just say that I found Kylo Ren intensely interesting, especially because of how emotionally volatile he was, how much of a fractured spirit he already was before he makes those really, really big swings and choices. So, we have to let it play out, honestly. That's all I can say on that. And again, I don't think Luke really needs big, big, crazy things. The Vong War is impractically too large compared to the Galactic Civil War. It makes that whole thing feel really small, and it shouldn't. It should feel like the Empire, even though it's only a 20-year reign of sorts, does do incredible things and damage across the galaxy that in the Legends, they're building up to the idea of like, "Oh, okay, but Palpatine always had this plan because he's trying to protect the galaxy and shape it the way that it needs to be before these extraterrestrial invaders." That works for books of series that wasn't expected to necessarily get sequel films. It doesn't work in a very movie, live action centric universe to me. It's just like, okay, if we do the Vong, and if that is the conflict that Rey's New Jedi Order deals with, yeah, I wouldn't even love that either. I don't know, I don't love the concept of the Vong and the war itself just destroying so much of the galaxy and being such a long difference. But I think it's you have to also consider how much of Star Wars is from a certain point of view. What Leia might not have any privy to because she's like, "Yeah, I've kinda no idea where Luke has been taking Ben." We get, like, the occasional updates and who knows? Maybe he's at the edge of the galaxy fighting off like different force sects and discovering crazy new pathways and worlds and stuff like that. We don't know. It might just be super important to a Jedi and the stories being told there. Like, for example, the High Republic right now. Everything going on affects the Jedi directly, right? The Nameless only affect Jedi and Force users. Everything going on with the Nile and the occlusion zone, that's super big for the Jedi. But for the most of the galaxy, they don't care about it. It's like, oh, it's the outer rim, it's the unwanted parts, it's the uncivilized parts, right? But it really comes to from your point of view and what's directly affecting these characters. And if it's big because it affects Luke, I think that matters more than it's big because it affects the galaxy. Because you can do the bantam level like jumping around to so many different stories and make them feel important and build up the character of Rey and of Luke without being like, oh, everything has to be constantly wiped out with another war. You don't have to do that, in my opinion. So that's where I'm kinda holding off on, and I like the idea of Luke, especially with Lore Santeca, exploring ruins and all that, that he gets into some crazy things with that, right? Maybe he's a deterrent too with between the Senate wanting, "Okay, we want another enforced, like, Jedi," especially more so than the prequels, because we saw what happened with Anakin and all that, and then you see all these Order 66 survivors who probably make up that first generation of Jedi Masters who are like, "No way, like, we saw what happened, like, we didn't let ourselves follow the Force, follow our intuition, especially during the prime of our, early careers of Jedi of the late Old Republic, early High Republic, whatever. Why would we do that? We went through so much because of the government being overrun, overtaken from the inside, like, why should we listen to anybody else? And why would they listen to Luke at that point, right? I think the question of Luke when he was written in the '90s is that he's the savior. That's what's gonna happen. The story's gonna be written out of that. Now that we've got the prequels, that it's simply impossible. Now that George Lucas has written that roadmap for that, he cannot in any way be as significant to the point of like, oh, he's gonna be all powerful, all knowing. He is the best of the best. Now it's more like he is, but the gap between him and second place and third place, it's not that big anymore. It really isn't. So, yeah, and, as my final comment, Kip Duron destroys a whole solar system, and we hand wave it off because Luke is like, "I'll take care of him. Watch out for him. I was just knocked out of commission by a random force spirit of a Sith Lord from the Old Republic." People just let that go for quite a lot of time, even in the New Jedi Order when they're like, "Oh, but Kip is like this and all that." Luke's just like, But it's fine. It's Kip. I don't disagree with him, but he is one of my students." That can't happen, right? And if anything, that should have had consequences that could be its own entire like 10-book series of like, how do we let this guy who's this powerful, come out of the first generation of Luke's academy? No one really deals with the consequences of the Jedi Academy trilogy at all. They just jump straight into New Jedi Order because, hey, Del Rey wanted to take over for Bantam and they got the deal.
And Luke is not going to ever be the same character again. We kind of have to accept that he's EU Luke is just completely different from canon Luke. But I do think there are plenty of ways to make canon Luke interesting. I think that's a good point. That you know, just because there aren't massive conflicts doesn't mean there aren't going to be things that change the characters. And I think that's something I've talked a lot about with Ben Solo, that we haven't seen anything about him, but we do know one of the things about him from The Last Jedi with Luke is that there's a lot of expectations put on him. There's a lot of weight on him. Instead of having four Skywalker, uh, descendants in the EU, we've got one. He is everything that Luke should be. He's everything that Leia and Han should be. He's the face of the most important, famous couple of the entire new government. He's the
Yeah.
face of the future of the Jedi Order. He has all these expectations, and there's a weight on his shoulders that's greater than anything that Jaina or Jason or Anakin really faced in terms of expectations, because there were more than one of them. And it was also just kind of part of the way those stories were written, right? They
Yeah.
are kind of get to choose their own path in more ways than one in the
Yeah.
EU, versus Ben being kind of now forced into, in a very prequel way, his Jedi training. And he is supposed to be now this great savior. And Luke says something like that in Last Jedi. He talks about how he tried to prevent Ben from turning the dark side because he saw his mighty Skywalker blood in him and he thought he could save him, even with all the signs of things going wrong. Right. And so there's a lot of those elements from a character's perspective that I do think you can use to elevate the character of Ben Solo, to make him, for lack of a better word, he is whiny, he is angsty, but a lot of it is he is torn more so than pretty much anybody we see in these movies, from the right and or the light and the dark, because he has the expectations on his shoulders more so than anybody since Anakin. And like I think they got to play up those Anakin parallels I've mentioned in the past.
Oh
Got
yeah.
to do some
Oh yeah.
messianic things with him. I mean, obviously he's not he doesn't have the virgin birth like Anakin does. He's not
Right.
supposed to be Jesus, but he is, for the lack of a better term, the great hope of the New Republic, right? He's the face of that. He's a celebrity from the day he's born. All those different things, right? They don't play those types of things up as much with Jason and Jaina when they're younger. The fact that
No.
they're celebrities, the fact that they're the son and daughter of the chancellor, and before that, the most famous person in the rebellion. Those expectations are just a part of what they deal with in the EU, versus in canon. They're playing with, I guess, a little bit more humanized version of that. When there's just one of them, how do they live up to that? And Jason and Jaina and Anakin do, especially Jason and Anakin, battle because they're both the boys. They're both the
Yeah.
descendants of Han and Leia and Luke, and they battle over their relationship with Luke. They're jealous with each other over their relationships with Luke or Han or Leia. So there is those components, but when you're an only child, when you're this kind of symbol, I think there are things that certainly could be played up there with Ben. And so I expect them to go that direction. I expect a lot of the important things in the life of Luke to also be important things in what shapes Ben Solo into Kylo Ren, because I understand what you're saying, and I completely agree with you, critical thinker, that right now, what we see from Kylo Ren, it is a little bit harder to believe his
Yeah.
fall. It's a little bit harder to believe why somebody would choose these things. But I think what I've always said, and it was one of my arguments for why Mara at least needs to be in this story, is there are obviously dozens, if not hundreds, of things that happen to him in his life that shape who this character is, with his relationship with his family, with his relationship with his uncle, with his relationship to a possible aunt, and maybe if they had a possible kid, different things that might have happened that put expectations on there. And if there was ever like a Ben Skywalker equivalent that either dies or disappears, how does that relate when you've been trained your whole life to become the next face of the Jedi Order, and now your uncle, the most famous Jedi in the world, the one that saved the Jedi, has an heir. There's a kind of a Game of Thrones element there you could play with. Um, is Ben's jealousy about, okay, am I going to be the person now, or is Luke's attention now pulled towards his wife and his possible son? There are a lot of different things that could play there. I don't think there's just going to be one specific, but yeah, when it comes to the future of these characters, when it comes to the future of Luke, I think definitively we can say it's not going to be as expansive or as exciting or as big or as important or as bold to the galaxy as it was in the EU. It's just not. It can't be the way they've structured it. It can't be. And part of that, I still blame both the studio and Ryan Johnson a little bit, because I really just wish Luke survived Last Jedi. I just really wish that happened. They could have cut out one frame and he could have survived and he could have been in The Rise of Skywalker and he could have still been alive for the future. But they didn't do that. So now we got to live with the fact that Luke is not going to be as important to these stories. And I think as long as you don't copy it and do an alternate take for Rey, there are a lot of different interesting directions you can go with Rey and her version of a Jedi Order that you know would be more so one that would be run by somebody like Kip Duron than a Luke Skywalker in the EU, right?
Yeah.
So that's what I expect. I expect a flawed Jedi Order. I expect a Jedi Order that's more embracing of the gray and the light and the dark. Um, Maybe follows in the post Ahsoka kind of way of being a Jedi, those types of things. I expect it to be really different. If it's not different and it's just the EU version of Luke, but with the Rey skin on it, I think we'll all be pretty disappointed by that, even if we do get to see some epic things come to screen. But I think they are going to need to embrace a lot of the different things that make Rey unique, not just make her Luke 2.0. But let's move on to the Andor story real quick, because we did spend a lot of time on the Rey discussion, and it is one that we're all passionate about. So we appreciate all of your guys' comments on that. Thank you so much to everybody sending them in. Again, keep sending them in. If you're just joining us now, this is a live Q&A. We're going to go for about another hour. So send in your questions, your comments, your thoughts on anything we talk about or anything you would like to discuss in the chat. First come, first serve. Unless you send in a super chat, then it bumps you up to the top, and we will answer all our super chats prior to ending tonight's stream. So if you'd like to make sure you get a chat in, send it in via super chat. And if you haven't liked the video yet, please like the video. It really helps our streams out. So let's get into Andor season 2, because we did get a pretty big reveal, not in the Disney Plus little promo sizzle reel, but shortly after that, from the release of the cover of Empire Magazine's January issue of their 2025 movie preview. And it does feature Cassian Andor, Mon Mothma, and of course, none other than Ben Mendehlson as director Orson Krennic on the cover. We've known for a while that Krennic is in this season, but now we get to see him actually on the cover. And the fact that he's on the cover, I think, speaks a little bit more to the volume of appearances that I would imagine he has than I certainly expected. I thought he'd be more sprinkled in. I think he is a villain that needs to be a part of what they're doing with the Imperial side of the story. We have the characters like Dedra and Cyril, who are obviously part of that Imperial story, but did have kind of the ghost of Cassian Andor and Luthen Rael and those types of characters to chase down. So how does a character like Krennic, that really doesn't have any involvement in the Cassian side of the story, how does he fit in as maybe a recurring character or a main villain of this story instead of just the main villain of one arc or arc closer to Rogue One? I think that's an interesting thing to look at. So we do have that reveal. We do have some more quotes from Diego Luna and Tony Gilroy and other people talking about the progression of season 1 to season 2. Diego Luna kind of giving the more canned, response about, well, we just need to get Cassian. He's so different in season 1 from who he is in Rogue One. We got to get him closer to there. So you have that type of quote. You have a discussion about K2's appearance and Alan Tudyk's appearances. And you get a little bit from Diego Luna about that, saying you get to see those connections, the fact that Cassian is best friends with the droid. What does that mean for him, especially one that he has to reprogram and for all intents and purposes shaped to be somebody he would like. That is an interesting relationship to explore. I didn't think about it that way, but he does say, oh, people have probably always imagined how the story of K2 and Cassian, how they met. Um, well, we didn't have to imagine that, Diego, because it's in a comic book. So I also wonder, we obviously expect that to be relatively, for the most part, kept, if not, expanded or slightly retconned. But that is, I guess, if you're a huge fan of that comic, a little concerning if he wasn't aware of the source material, because they might not have made it like a required reading part of this the episode that we see the two of them meet. But that's all right. I really could care less if that's retcon or not. But yeah, and then we have Tony Gilroy confirming that they're going to do a lot of stuff with Yavin, saying that no one has quite dealt with Yavin the way they will be dealing with it. So we're going to see, I think, a lot more Yavin, and not just the location of Yavin, but a lot of the politics and the politicking around both the senatorial politics on Yavin, but also the military politics on Yavin that we saw a lot of in Rogue One. So hearing all this stuff, Sanak and seeing Ben Mendehlson now officially revealed in these images from Empire magazine, what were your thoughts on these updates to Andor season 2?
I mean, I'm always excited for more Ben Mendelsohn. He's one of my favorite actors, and he's just got this funny, like, sick humor sometimes. Like, there's that meme of like, "You haven't been talking to cops, have you, mate?" And I kinda just want him to do that, but with Krennic, 'cause he's this middleman. Like, that's kinda how he describes it. He's someone that has influence, has power, but he's no Tarkin. He's no Vader, right? Once he runs up to them, he realizes just how lowly he is, right? So, yeah, I absolutely wanna see what he can do here, fleshed out, especially with characters that don't have anything to say or suggest that they will live into the Rogue One part of the timeline, right? I mean, sure, maybe some do, and then they just become other members of rebellion cells that we just haven't followed in other comics or books or whatever, but I expect a lot of these guys to die. I really do, and I think that would add stakes. At the same time, we don't wanna overdo it, but then when you bring in a Krennic, right, and especially with the Imperials, you don't have to kill them, but you can do some really horrible things to just, like, break them and who they are and leave them essentially dead as characters, right? So, yeah, no, he makes a big point of like, "Oh, Dedra's this big hotshot, he's doing all this thing, working with Cyril, but when I show up, like, "Really? Who are you?" Like, exact and I'm like, "Yeah." So we're gonna see some really messed up things happen there that I'm very excited for, of him just kinda moving his weight around. Um, I do want it to be as closely tied as possible to Catalyst and all that stuff happening with the Death Star development. I do wanna see and maybe, like, some adaptation of, like, him sending notes and stuff to updates on what's going on in the project. Maybe he's actually around the ISB because 'cause they're trying to snoop into his projects, and he's like, "No, no, no. Yes, we are all part of the same department, but I am not the same as you," and stuff like that. I'd love to see stuff like that come into play. Um, obviously, Yularen made an appearance in the show, so I wonder if that's maybe his entry point into meeting Dedra and all that, so it'll be pretty interesting no matter what, his role is. He's just an absolute wild card of an actor and a character. And I do admit in some ways I find him a little disappointing in Rogue One because a lot of the material that was leading into his appearance, like especially that first Thrawn novel, when there is that hint of like, okay, here's Director Krennic and what he's doing with these trainees and all of the influence that he has there. He seems so much more like composed and grand and like really someone that it's a shock that he's not sitting at the table there on the Death Star in A New Hope. Uh, it makes a little bit more sense with how kind of, like, explosive he can be sometimes personality-wise in Rogue One and, like, some of the bad gambles that he makes, but I wanna see, like, him still dominate his arena for a bit and then, you know, make some headway in some areas and kinda lose out in others. I'd like to see him win. I just do. I just wanna see him have fun and be scummy and chummy and everything all about it. Because that's what I liked about the character, and I like to see how he can almost, like, play off of his environments and get personas out. Like, we've seen so many of these characters play with personas. Why not Krennic? That's someone I wanna really see kinda play into, like, this is, like, the almost like that hero, mysterious figure that all of these trainees and academy students that were talking about in that Thrawn novel, and I wanna see maybe him play into that image, and then you get to see more of that Krennic that is in Rogue One when he's more alone or more dealing with, like, his higher ups or things kinda going wrong behind the scenes for him, so excited for that. The Yavin stuff, I don't know, man. That gets me really excited about the possibility of Gilroy at least dipping his toes into, like, Force and history and stuff like that. Like, I'd love to see the Masasi Temple actually, like, explained with the Masasi, mythology of Exar Kun. You can leave him unnamed or whatever and kinda hint at that, give us our first real taste of at least Tales of the Jedi era Republic here. I'd love to see something like that be hinted at. And maybe that is like an entry point for why the rebellion goes to Yavin, right? Obviously in Jedi Academy trilogy, he's like, "Oh yeah, like this was like an old, incredible like ground for the rebellion and all that." But there are some like interesting things here with the Force, and that's where Exar Kun comes into play. Maybe this we have other, Force users running around the galaxy, maybe some interesting new Force sect that's very grounded, doesn't necessarily have the Force, that is, like, more of a mythological preservers, oral narrators who are like, maybe this planet historically is able to keep a lot of, like, good groups hidden away with the darkness that is permeating. Just I'd love to see his take on, like, a Force user or Force influentials out here, and maybe that's why they come to the Yavin. Obviously, I think it means more like exploring other temples and like the area, maybe new fauna and new environments on the planet. But it'd be nice to see some really interesting reasons for and multiple reasons for why the rebels eventually come to Yavin. Because even Star Wars Rebels never really broached it. They were just there eventually. So I'd love to see what goes on there. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, Cassian stuff, it's probably going to be retconned away. Though, I do think in my heart that B2 EMO, because he doesn't show up in Rogue One and all that, obviously was created later. It's because they're gonna take his memory module, put it in K2, kind of blend it together. And as a separatist growing up, right, like, I do wonder what his relationship is with droids because he hates clone troopers. He goes to, like, try to fight them in his flashbacks. So I do wonder if, like, droids were almost like allies or friends for a lot of his life, before he went to Ferrix, and maybe this is him kind of reconnecting to the past. Maybe this is what helps him connect to that whole sister question, where if she's alive, where she is. I think that'd be pretty interesting to like explore that youth that we don't see from Cassian, other than when it's robbed of him.
Yeah, and I think that would be really cool to treat Yavin as a kind of a character in this. I don't know
Yeah.
if that's what they're gonna do, but that would be really cool if there is some type of little subplot about discovering the history of Yavin, trying to bring that back maybe into the fold and talking about Luke and his academy, trying to bring some of those elements back. Be really interesting if they go that direction. I think when I hear Yavin, I'm definitely thinking more like the meetings between the rebels. Like, I just want to see that type of stuff. The hierarchy. How does somebody who's like as much of a wild card as Luth and Rail really fit into the hierarchy of military politics inside the upper echelon of the rebellion, right? As we creep closer and closer, and we're going to probably see the rebellion, the true formation of the rebellion redone here in a way, or at least some of the aftermath of that. I still do think a Hera cameo is really likely. Absolutely want to see General Draven in this. I really want to see that character back. I really liked that character from Rogue One. Be really cool to see that character. General Merrick, who is Blue Leader in Rogue One, and I'd like to see him. Makes me want to see Bail Organa more. Hopefully, we get some Jimmy Smits. Hopefully, we do get as critical thinker is saying as well. I'd love to see Garmbel Iblis or some of these other
Oh yeah.
characters that might
Oh yeah.
really help form the early stages of the rebellion, and even some characters from Rebels, like if we got Sato or some of these other early rebel leaders. I would like to see that, and especially if they do want to do Garmbel Iblis, and they could, I think they could put him in the movie, and obviously he won't have as big of a role as he had in legends, but you could put him in the movie and he could, I mean, in the show, and he could still survive and be, used for later uses if they wanted to, and kind of like explain that away. And then maybe he come back like he did in the Thrawn trilogy, and show back up later on as this, outcast. But yeah, they could do something like that, or they could use him as somebody who ends up having some type of heroic sacrifice amongst the early rebel leaders, really showing the warrior element of those early rebel leaders, or the heart and soul and what it takes to be a rebel, partially, and maybe inspiring a Mon Mothma or a Bail Organa instead of working right alongside them. So that would be cool. I think a lot of that stuff. I just would like to see that Dodona. I'd be okay with the guy from Game of Thrones coming back and playing Dodona again, but I just want to see all of that stuff. I want to see all of that stuff really at the forefront of this, because when I originally fell in love with the character of Cassian Andor in Rogue One, he is an assassin, and I want to see how he transforms from who we saw in season one into an assassin. Like, he's more distant than he is in season one by the
Oh
end
yeah,
of this show. So
totally
how
agree.
does he get even more distant? I want to see that. It's kind of like, mostly the alternate type of character building you're used to with TV shows. Instead of making the character a little bit more human, you're making him less and less human as the show goes on. And I would like to see the characters who shape him, who use him as a tool, and really make him into a killer, as we talk about multiple times as in the themes of Rogue One. So I want to see all of that. Can't wait to see Ben Mendelsohn. I was assuming when they pretty much confirmed that he was going to be in the show, I was assuming it was going to kind of be maybe the last arc of season two, one of those arcs that they start to hear about rumors of the Death Star, and Cassian is kind of sent on his missions, and obviously ends up in the exact place we see him at the beginning of the movie. So that's where I was expecting to see Ben Mendelsohn, is one of those Death Star related missions, but maybe rumors of the Death Star are happening throughout this entire season. You get to see more from that perspective, or at least the Imperial perspective. Obviously, getting Imperial characters a lot in season one, it wouldn't be shocking if Ben Mendelsohn is a character that just also progresses with the POV every single time jump. I wouldn't be
Yeah.
surprised at that at all, but we do have such a massive cast in season two, and with all these time jumps and with the different arcs and the different stories, very intrigued, confident because I believe in this team, but very intrigued to see where they're going and how they structure this story, because that's just another massive character to add to it on top of all the other characters that we have. So can't wait to see that. Can't wait to see how this all unfolds. And Andor season two, it was already one of our most anticipated Star Wars things ever. Certainly one of my most anticipated things for next year. Cannot wait to see what they do with that show. We do have some other topics and some other news information around Skeleton Crew I'd like to get to. Some stuff with Outlaws that were big announcements, but we're going to take some of your guys' questions right now, because we've gone for about an hour, and the only questions we've taken, or the comments we've taken, have been around the news story. So we're going to go back to the top and take some of your questions and comments. First, I do want to mention Critical Thinker's thoughts on that last story, saying, I hope Garmbel Iblis lives. We already have Saw to fill the role if you're talking about, and it'd be nice to see one of the more military focused rebel leaders survive. It would be cool, and I think they could definitely use them and bring them back. They're obviously in the perfect spot right now, doing their translation of Thrawn for the Mandalorian. They're in the perfect spot to introduce that character and then bring him back. What would it be, like 10 years later or so,
Yeah.
in the Thrawn stuff with Mandalorian? So hopefully that is a direction they want to go, and we'll see what they do there. Scrolling back up to the top, Brandon Tran first says, first question, what are your guys' favorite scenes from the Revenge of the Sith novel by Matthew Stover that weren't in the original movie? That's that's a tough one, because it's been a very long time since I've read the book. So it's going to be hard for me to just give you a scene off the top of my head. But what I would say is that one of the things that makes that novelization so perfect is the fact that the story and Revenge of the Sith, I think most people would agree, is, if not the best, one of the best Star Wars stories of all time. And what Stover does is expand the movie scenes. And so for me, a lot of the most memorable parts of the book are the things that he expands, like the different thing hearing people's thoughts on different sequences, whether it's more Obi-Wan, more Anakin internal conflict, hearing people's internal thoughts on the major plot points that are, could be memes in today's world, but like the Anakin not becoming a master thing, you hear Anakin's thoughts more. You hear Mace Windu's thoughts, you hear Yoda's thoughts, you hear everybody's analysis of certain situations. So those types of moments stuck with me, more Palpatine's thoughts as he's manipulating Anakin. That's something that's always stuck with me. Um, but yeah, and the Coruscant battle is much more expanded in the beginning to me, from what I remember. But I got to think back. I can't remember specifics. It's been a good 10 years or more since I've read the book, so I can't think of too many off the top of my head. Sorry.
I can, and it's mostly because I remember very distinctly why I really enjoyed the book, and it's because it's the Padme and Anakin stuff that I really like, because you get a lot more
Hmm.
of her POV, like how she's like talks about like this is a gift and like the scariest thing ever I'm offering. They talk about it's a boy, no, it's a girl, right? Like, and you get to see them be a couple, right? That's one thing I really like about Brotherhood, that it's immediately just been like, okay, this is just a there's still some things that you can flesh out in between that gap between Attack of the Clones and the start of the book, and that book kinda does allow for, like, that first day of the war that O3 Clone Wars does to kinda still be canon of sorts, but, yeah, it really is just about, like, who are they as a couple, right? And that's something Clone Wars '08 did a lot better as time went on. I think it made some okay attempts at to start off with, but it started getting into more of, like, the questions of jealousy and pride and fearfulness that Anakin has, that Padme is trying to really discourage him from because, come on, it's Padme, and they're both, like, star-crossed lovers, but, yeah, I do like a lot of that scene there. There was I don't know, there are some things that I don't looking back, I find are a little unnecessary, like, I think, like, at one point when Anakin's holding up Grievous, like, not Grievous, he's holding up Obi-Wan in the elevator shaft, his lightsaber drops, and then he just is like Grievous sends his Magna Guards to get it, and I'm like, "Okay, that" it really does play into the whole idea that the invisible hand sequence of the film was really supposed to be, like, an hour longer, honestly, like, just so much going on there. You get to see a little bit more fear and, like, the thoughts swirling in Dooku's head too. I like that Vader and his regrets, once he's kinda put into the suit, kinda come more into the forefront, whereas that's just played off as a montage. There's also that one scene where, like, it's like Palpatine well, no, there's, like, the whole thing, going back to that relationship with Padme and Anakin where Palpatine, like, kinda plays into the idea a little bit and pushes a little bit more aggressively that, like, "Hey, what if, like, Obi-Wan is, like, having an affair with your wife?" Right? Like, they seem to be talking a lot more, and that's something that I think I don't love necessarily, but I think having it there really does play into, like, exactly why he snaps the moment he sees Obi-Wan at the top of the ramp on Mustafar. Like, it's just why he goes into that straight force choke, and I think it really plays well into the jealousy that he has for Padme and her relationship with, the Bacon Clan guy. I'm forgetting his name when from the Clone Wars,
Clovis.
Clovis, Rush Clovis, right?
Yeah.
So, I think that works really well hand in hand and plays into Palpatine being, again, that crazy manipulator. Uh, I don't know, there's some stuff with maybe the beginning of the battle that I thought was cool, but, like, it's not gonna compare to what we see in the film, the pace and the energy of that especially, so yeah, I mean, again, as great of a book as it is and what Stover writes is the nuances in between that are definitely pulled from the, like, the shooting script. Um, that I think what that book really highlights is that Lucas, at least by that 3rd film in that prequel trilogy, that ender of his original 6, he honestly was cooking there. He was just a much older man who didn't have someone that would necessarily pull him back from some of his extremes, but he learned, he adjusted, and by the time of that 3rd film, his political messaging, the manipulation, the literal lore that is there from A New Hope and the original trilogy, he's been set up for it, and he mostly smashes it out of the park in his own film. So, I think it's just a credit to Stover, like, highlighting all that stuff and then bringing out some of the things that just there wasn't time for in the with the medium of the film.
I remembered one when you were talking to, that I loved, loved ironically in parts because it's a brilliant, bold attempt at reclaiming one of the goofiest parts of the movie, and that is the Sith scream.
Oh,
uh,
yeah. Oh, boy.
the corkscrew, as I love to call it, 720-degree corkscrew is, one of the weirdest choices, one of the strangest shots in the whole movie, with Palpatine versus the Jedi Masters. And, it was something that I've always ironically loved because it is so ridiculous, and, that speaks to my one of the reasons why Revenge of the Sith is my favorite is because I think it's the best story of Star Wars with still the trappings of the ridiculousness that George Lucas constantly brings to Star Wars, and, I grew up loving that style, loving that movie, and just the attempt at trying to explain it away, I always appreciated, even if it is just a goofy, ridiculous CGI thing to do because, McDermott couldn't move very quickly when they were shooting the the movie. But yeah, the Sith Scream, that's my favorite. Brandon says, second question. Do you think bounty hunter Dirge, who has previously appeared in 2003's Clone Wars and the Boba Fett novel Hunted, should fight Din Djarin in Mandalorian and Grogu? I wouldn't be opposed to that. I think Dirge is awesome, but do I think he actually would be in the movie? No. Um, do would it be cool if he is? Yeah. Although I would say that, like, I don't know. I think it part of me would find that Dirge is a little diminished if Mandalorian and Grogu beat him versus the fact that Obi-Wan, you know, had to fight him like 2 or 3 times to finally finish him off and get swallowed up inside him. So I would prefer it if somebody a little more powerful fought Dirge. Would it just be cool to see him? Yeah, and he's not terribly important to me enough to where I would be disappointed if he shows up to fight Mandalorian. But yeah, I love it's my icon for our channel. Our character art is the Obi-Wan suit from that scene, and it's always been one of my favorite things. That whole sequence, that whole jousting sequence, it's so fun, and I would love to see Dirge live action finally, but I don't know if that's the movie that's gonna make it happen, but it would be cool if it did.
Yeah, because I think my fear there is like, yeah, oh yeah, finally we get to see Dirge, and then we get to actually see him in canon with his whole body contorting and stretching out and all that, and proving that he can't really be killed by conventional means. While that would be awesome to see, it does feel like Grogu and Din Djarin should not be doing that. I think Grogu, if he was older, doing that would be like, yeah, that's understandable, especially once he's like a fully trained Mandalorian that happens to have a lot of Jedi powers and maybe a new dark saber or something like that, right? So I think that would be okay, but I agree with Liam. I think that fight there that they have in O3 Clone Wars of first starting off with like the whole like jousting kinda duel with the speeders, and then you see, like, they start chipping away at each other, and then you just see Obi-Wan, like, repel everything with, like, with the Force and all. It is a pretty dang iconic fight. That's what I love about that first day of the Clone Wars of '03 is that everyone is at the top of the game. And it's like it's because it's not because that they've learned anything new or become stronger in any specific way. It's just they have to be. It's like everything is to the force. They're kind of fresh. Let's be honest. And I do think we don't consider the athletic, spiritual, and all the different conditions that come with leading a war, the logistics and all that start weighing down on these characters. Whereas that first day, your clones don't have personalities and considerations really. They just do their job, especially with Fordo and everyone else. Like they're there as a hit squad. That's it, right? That they're gonna be going into monoliths and doing things that are needed. You're gonna let Anakin go crazy in the spaceship because he hasn't had many battles to really consider strategy. He just leads them because he's a commander and he happens to have a souped up Delta fighter, so it's like, yeah, so stuff like that is what I really love, and that's where Dirge really works. And I know people are gonna bring up Star Wars Republic with how Asajj is handled there and how Dirge is handled there. And yes, don't get me wrong, they make them super moody and edgy and super powerful and all that, and a lot more nuanced. But I don't think anything even from that tops what we get there from O3 Clone Wars. So I'd like canon to continue what Brotherhood did, where they just basically like canonize that duel, maybe pull it back a little bit, just like how Mace Windu punching droids on Dantooine is practically canon. Um, so far, it seems like at least what they've done in canon, especially in the original trilogy and his appearances in Afra and Bounty Hunters, has been mostly like this is a guy who's lived so long and forced to recomposite his body so many times that he's gone from, like, this ruthless killer to being, like, someone that's kinda halfway there all the time and just, like, so damaged and, like, just a walking zombie that I think if you say, like, "Oh, it's because Obi-Wan literally exploded him at some point at the start of the war and, like, took him out as, like, one of the best weapons that the early CIS had," I would like that, really. I think that is pretty smart, honestly. So bring him back, and then maybe over time he heals and does something, and by like the Grogu's reign as the Mandalore or something that there's a big fight, sure. But I think Mandalorian and Grogu's got a lot more Imperial Remnant stuff that they should spend time on, and interesting factions like the Underground and a possible Talon Card and all that to really spend more time on, and would be more worthwhile for that conflict. Versus Dirge would just be more like a distraction and like a souped up IG-11.
Critical Thinker says, I finished the Dark Nest trilogy. My opinions are mixed, but positive overall. Luke and Leia have good character arcs, but Jason seems to have forgotten what Vergeer actually told him in New Jedi
Oh
Order.
yeah.
Yeah, Jason
Yeah.
has short-term memory. Jason changes so much between Unified Force and Legacy of the Force. But
It's
yeah, hopefully you enjoy Legacy of the Force, and glad you're continuing with that post Return of the Jedi timeline. Kenobi's Cantina says, I'm not going to be able to make the live stream tonight, but I want to say thank you for being one of my inspirations for starting my Star Wars YouTube channel. The character versus character idea I use is so good. So thank you. Well, you're welcome. I'm glad you enjoy our content. Appreciate hearing that. It makes us feel good when we hear that people have enjoyed our content and it's inspired them to do their own thing. So great. And we'll have to check out your channel too. So thanks for commenting, and really appreciate the comment here.
yeah, thank you very much.
Brandon says, third question. Do you think Dark Side Fallen Anakin Skywalker, or most people call him Nightfall Anakin Skywalker, in Revenge of the Sith could beat both Darth Revan and Darth Malak from KOTOR in terms of strength and power, force powers? Well, at the same time, if you fought them 2 against 1, I don't know. I know a lot of people like the whole Nightfall Anakin is like the ultimate in terms of power scaling. Well, I don't know. A lot of people like to hold him there. The Star Wars power scalers, which I don't necessarily consider myself one of them, um, but Star Wars power scalers really like to use a lot of justification that I think in some ways are reaches. And one of the things you'll hear a lot about Star Wars power scalers say to you is that, well, since the prequel era Jedi are supposed to be the peak of the Jedi Order, evolving and constantly growing and becoming better and better than they were in the Old Republic, that any prequel era Jedi should easily be able to beat any Old Republic era Jedi. And then, of course, Revan and Malak, prior to becoming Sith, were Old Republic era Jedi, and then, should also be weaker than prequel era Sith because of the rule of two and all of that. To which I genuinely think, or generally think, that is a bunch of nonsense, because I think a lot of the unhinged force powers that were there in the Old Republic before the power really became more reined in, not just in storytelling, but the ideas and the limits that were placed on both Jedi and on Sith throughout the post KOTOR timeline, I think really need to be taken into consideration. I don't really care what a source book says. I don't really think that Revan is weaker than Darth Millennial because he's a Banite Sith. I just don't. So, so yeah, when it comes to, but I would say, I think Anakin would have a tough time fighting Revan and Malak. at the same time, especially peak Revan and peak Malik right before Malik betrays Revan. I would say that would be pretty difficult. I mean, if we want to hold him up to like who Anakin at the same time loses to, it's Obi-Wan. He gets 3 of his limbs cut off by Obi-Wan. So, and do I think Obi-Wan could take Revan and Malik? I think he would be a better match against Revan and Malik at the same time in terms of a duel, because I think Obi-Wan's defensive mastery would be strong against any Sith. Really, it's more of a Dooku who's a brilliant swordsman who's able to pose a threat for an Obi-Wan. But in terms of force power, I do think that Anakin at that point could be as powerful, if not more powerful, than anybody. But this is all coming from the point of view of somebody who's not like an official lore source book based power scaler, but just based on my interpretation of the Star Wars universe and my knowledge of Star Wars and the stories, actually reading the stories of these characters or playing the stories of these characters. I don't think Anakin could take Revan and Malik at the same time. If it's just a force power off, maybe. But if it's a duel, I think he would struggle in Revenge of the Sith.
Yeah, I generally think along the same lines because I don't know, Jedi are all unique and different, and we have to also assume the same thing with Sith, especially Sith that are holding on to power after they lose that athletic martial fitness that really does define them more so than a Jedi does. And yes, Nightfall, Anakin is pretty hard to beat. I think that's a given, right? And I think a lot of that is fed from the Episode 3 video game where he is actually going through Operation Nightfall. He beats Sindralig, right? And he's supposed to be the master swordsman that teaches everyone like the 7 forms. And he's got his apprentice who's a dual-bladed lightsaber wielder, and it's kind of a 2v1 there. And then there's a couple other things that happen in between. Yeah, so it's like I can see that argument, especially with like a lot of the tie in more visual elements that we've seen of Nightfall. But I think, yeah, I agree with Liam because that's stuff that Lucas did and you people added to it versus the Old Republic is, for all intents and purposes, just not touched at all by Lucas. He never really had interest in that. So they go wild there. And we as fans appreciate that, but that doesn't necessarily line up with the Star Wars prequel trilogy, even if you want to say like, oh, they're diminished because their observance and power of the Force has been clouded by the Sith over a millennia, and it's been slowly wearing them down. A lot of people have been kind of sneaking in internally as agents of the Senate and the Jedi Order attendants and stuff. Yeah, you can say all those things and why they're diminished, and that's why they're kind of weaker. But I don't know, man. It's a tough one because then, like I said, like Liam was saying, the flip side is, yeah, okay. There's a lot of thinking, especially in a lot of the novels, that say Sith grow on top of each other. The Bay Knights Sith keep going. So why wouldn't the Jedi, especially if really the biggest successes of the Bay Knights Sith maybe come maybe 200 years? That's when you start really noticing the effects on the Jedi, and we don't really know much about that era in the EU. I don't know. It's a weird one to consider. I would say Nightfall to me, right, considering all those questions and what we have seen and read about it, I look at him as like he gives into the emotion and it's quicker, right? That's the part that Yoda talks about. It's quicker, not necessarily stronger. And I think you get to see like a huge bump up for him where he's just emotionally charged and it doesn't matter. He's like an unstoppable wall. But for a Sith like Revan and Malik, especially if we're talking about them in their primes as master and apprentice before the physical dismemberment of Malik's jaw, before Revan is brain wiped and everything, are we gonna really say that Anakin with that power bump is enough to go with guys who have been fully steeped in the dark side for 2, 3 years at that point, who have gone on some crazy expeditions and stuff like that, have ventured to the unknown regions, and even if you don't love the Old Republic, have faced an incredibly all living emperor, right? I don't know. I don't think so. I think that's where Anakin could beat a Malik, but then when he faces a Revan, he's seeing like a realized version of him. Especially because Malik is also a dual wielder too. That's gonna be tough for him. He doesn't have a lot of great experience with dual wielders, both canon and legend. So that'll be tough. I think he can handle a Malik, but it would just be a matter of him like using his indomitable spirit and dark side powers that are just emerging very rapidly to overwhelm him in a moment of need and panic. But I don't think Revan would necessarily fall for that. And, that to the point that Liam brings up of like, "Oh, but Kenobi handles Anakin, right?" It's like, well, at the end of the day, sometimes it is really just about matchups. You can be the best at every single thing. You can be the best boxer in your heavyweight division, right? And yet someone who might have just retired and come back, figured out, "Hey, I got something here that nobody's noticed. Like, I can get you a nice liver shot and you'll go down," right? That's how I always look at Anakin versus Obi-Wan, because I don't think Obi-Wan beats him even with Soresu Ataru combined, just by pure martial talent. No, no, but not even with the Force, but he has that emotional connection. He knows to push and pull, and he's taking advantage of Anakin's over aggressiveness and like we said, going quicker, going faster, not realizing just how much he's pushing it more than he usually does, and how he's leaving himself exposed. So yeah, I mean, the matchup really does matter. We don't know how Revan really fights outside of the video game, and that is kinda just up to you. Malik doesn't really get much outside of cutscenes. I guess they're both a little bit more force move dependent, so maybe they would be pretty bad at lightsaber duels compared to, like, a prequel Jedi who's been trained and gone through that warfare of, like, killing so many different species and droids and all that. That's something we have to also consider as well, so yeah, that's kinda where I'd put it. For sure, Malik, maybe not Revan. He would have to take advantage of some quick power bumps that he gets.
Yeah, I agree. I think he would easily beat Malik by himself. Um, and I think he would. I do think he would beat Revan by himself, but them together, I think that's where. It'd be, so I'm not sure if you're asking if like they're tag teaming him or if it's a 1v1. But yeah, thanks for the question. Kenobi's Cantina again says, I just made the channel on October 27th, 2024. And I really appreciate watching your channel and watching you guys go from 100 subs to now 18,000 subs. It's been really inspiring. Well, we really appreciate that. Thank you. And hopefully you keep enjoying the content. But yeah, it's been a wild ride, especially this year has been so much bigger for us than we could have really hoped for and imagined. It's been really a struggle for us these last few years trying to
Yeah.
find ways to carve out our section of the Star Wars YouTube community. And there's been some things we've done this year that really seem to have worked and you guys seem to enjoy. So, and these lives are one of them. So, yeah, we're glad you guys are enjoying the content and hopefully we give you guys an even better year next year in 2025. Critical Thinker says, I also read Light of the Jedi, and hot take, I don't like it. There's way too many characters with so little development. Good guys, bad guys, and civilians are very cookie cutter, making it very difficult to care about the big crisis since the novel relies so much on the pathos of seeing these characters struggle and die to sell that crisis, and it ends up feeling repetitive and unengaging. Markion Rowe is really the only interesting character, and even he only becomes interesting at the very end of the novel. Does this improve in later books? Well, you're kind of asking the wrong people because I think we both really, really enjoyed Light of the Jedi. So it's hard to tell you if it improves. I personally don't think the High Republic has gotten better than Light of the Jedi and Rising Storm, that double. So I would say read the Rising Storm, and if you don't like it, I don't think you're going to enjoy the High Republic overall. Um, but I understand what you mean. I understand what you mean for sure. It is the foundational book, right? It's laying so many things, and that has been one of the consistent criticisms of Light of the Jedi is the fact that it has so many things in it that it can feel like it's spreading itself too thin. And I understand and appreciate that. But for me, when I first read it, I loved the way it built the world, the way it felt so different from the rest of what we've read in Star Wars canon or Star Wars Legends. It felt big, it felt epic. I love the focus originally on the Great Disaster. I liked a lot of those early Jedi. I found them interesting and different and compelling, and they had unique voices. They weren't the Jedi we're so accustomed to. I thought a lot of what Charles Soule does in building that world. And as you guys know from my history on this channel, I love first movies. I love the way things are set up. I love the way things are built. I do love seeing Markion Rowe's arc in that book because I do think I completely disagree that he's not interested in the beginning. I thought he was great the whole time. I thought his rise from unassuming, kind of sidekick to the one that takes control to like grab the reins. I thought it was really well written. I really enjoyed it. So, but yeah, I would say if you're looking at the High Republic and you're wanting to get into now what is it? 7 adult books, I think, and 7 young adult books. So if you want to read all of those two, it's 14 books. If you're wanting to get into that entire thing and you don't like the Rising Storm, I don't think you're going to find something in the High Republic that you are going to enjoy. Um, I could say finish with the Fallen Star just to finish that trilogy because it is a tight knit trilogy. And right now, if you just want to skip phase two, which goes backwards in time, it's a prequel story, and continue with the story of these characters and Mark Young that story isn't complete yet because the last book comes out next year. So you could wait and read that trilogy when it comes out next year, the finale trilogy, instead of jumping into the 2 books that are out right now. But yeah, I really don't think you're going to enjoy the High Republic much more if you don't like Light of the Jedi and Rising Storm. So give Rising Storm a shot, and hopefully it gets a little better for you.
Yeah, I mean, I agree on all those points. I'm someone who definitely loves middle parts because when you get them right, I think they're just fantastic, and you get to see what's coming next, and you're so hyped for how you've taken what's a big foundational piece and you've set it up for a big finale. And yeah, I think both of us agree Fallen Star is not as good as Rising Storm and Light of the Jedi, and a lot of that comes down to the fact that there was a choice, um, logistically, yeah, storytelling wise, that everything comics, young adult books, junior novels, everything has to like come into the Fallen Star, um, which I think is a bit disappointing because it does make it feel very claustrophobic, even if that is intentional. But yeah, no, Rising Storm is my favorite for sure. It is the one that has a little bit more focus than Light of Jedi for sure. You're dealing with all the consequences. It definitely does recap a lot of it, but it has a little bit more predefined groups to me. So I think you don't get as lost. Whereas like you'll see like 4 Jedi in Light of Jedi, and then 2 of them die, and then that remnant will join another group, and a couple more, and then there's going to be some pilots, and yeah, I agree that it is a lot. It is a lot to get into for Light of the Jedi. But I that is why I loved it, because it was like the galaxy is reacting to something that is affecting everyone. Everyone has to be on guard because we don't know when the fragments will shoot out of hyperspace and just destroy and eviscerate planets like that. And I loved how the Republic came together and they started like planning and thinking about the logistics of that. The Nile. I mean, they don't really ever get the same structural explanation and like thinking and time, right? But in this one, they put so much into it that it's hard not to like get interested in like, oh, what does each storm do? What does each strike do? And like, who are these like leaders? And why is Markin Road now making his move? Like, I love that stuff. So if you didn't really like that from the start, and that's definitely what I think Liam and I want to point out, that was the thing that like almost hooked us on more so than even the heroes at that point.
Hmm.
It'll be hard. It'll be hard without a doubt. Give Rising Storm a try. That's okay. It's fine if you don't, continue after that. You don't have to necessarily get into it, right? It is very much a book reader oriented part of the Star Wars universe, and it's not a book reader in the same sense as here we're gonna have Luke lead the way in this new saga that involves our original trilogy heroes. It's more like, hey, let's look at the Jedi Order as it becomes a lot more stuck in with a very, very existential threat to them, and how that's going to shape and form the prequel Jedi that we'll eventually see. The choices that are going to be made here that in the next 100 years will have some dire consequences and take us away from some of the idealistic stuff that we do get to really see with the Jedi, even though this is like the first real conflict in years. They're so enthusiastic and positive, and they're going about it with teamwork, with using some really interesting force, connections and skills and everything. So that's why I loved it, and I think both of us will agree too that the High Republic is very much a completionist thing. It's not just like, oh, read the adult books and you'll be good. You'll be mostly good, but
Yeah.
then you'll miss like a lot of the Drengir plot that has very much a young adult focus and has a lot of stuff, especially in the comics. You read everything and it feels like an incredible world, an incredible part of the Star Wars universe that unless you're not fully dedicated to it, you don't really get it, right? So, and that's a hard sell for a lot of people. I absolutely agree for that, but we're fanatics, so it's been really easy for us to enjoy a lot of stuff, even if there has definitely been some stuff that's been dragging its feet or just not as good as others because somehow we'll see like an incredible comic miniseries like Trail of Shadows that like just changes genre conventions that we don't usually get from comics. Then we'll get a junior novel like Test Occurs that you're like middle school books can be this good and still spin off of like a bigger conflict like that. And then the comics that we're getting, right? Like, yeah, I mean, there's a lot to love about it if you can get into it. If you can't, then not everything about Star Wars we love, right? But this just happens to be one of them.
Then Critical Thinker says, "Do you think the EU should be used as source material for new canon material, or would you prefer it if canon went in its own direction and the EU inspired stuff was adapted separately, like you said in your EU video?" Well, I'm in favor of both. I still am very much so in favor, and that's never going to happen. I knew it was never going to happen when I made the video, but I'm still very much in favor of doing an alternate universe because the EU currently is an alternate universe. That's what I get why people are so upset and frustrated about a new continuity. I was the same way, not necessarily as frustrated, but I am frustrated by the fact that you have to, the stuff that you have invested forever in, you have is now not part of the new storytelling. But it's not like that stuff's erased forever. It's its own universe. And so if you're willing to, you can embrace and enjoy that universe and it's a different timeline. It's just like a multiverse. I'm not saying multiverse in terms of crossover. You shouldn't don't think Star Wars should cross between dimensions, but it is a multiverse. You can have different stories. You can have Elseworlds world's tales. You can have different timelines. And we've already established that Star Wars is that by having two different timelines. So I'm still very much in favor of the idea of bringing in a lot of the EU style storytelling in its own adapted or adaptation, especially because there's so many elements of the EU, like we've talked about already in the stream with Jason and Jaina and Luke's Academy and all these different things that you can never bring into the canon version. But I also am not offended when canon takes stuff from the EU and has their own spin. I know a lot of people out there are offended by that, but to me, it's an adaptation. It's just like an adaptation of any book. It's never going to be one to one. It's to me, I look at it a lot like comics, and as you know, a critical thinker, and I saw some questions about comics later. I'm a big comic fan. I'm a big fan of DC. I'm a big fan of Marvel. And part of when you get a movie like Captain America: Civil War, it's not at all the same as Civil War or Avengers Infinity War is
Oh,
actually Infinity Gauntlet. Um, and it's still not even that much like Infinity Gauntlet. So, they take these names, they take some ideas, they take some characters, and they run with what's in their universe. And to me, that's always been what Star Wars and the EU should be when it comes to canon adaptations. And I think that's why canon should look to the EU and some of the characters and scenarios and things they've done that could inspire those stories being retold. Now, where I think it would be a massive mistake is for them to just be like, "Oh, the Yuzhan Vong, let's just redo that, but since we can't use Luke, let's use Ray." Like, I don't think that's a good idea because now you're directly inviting one-to-one comparison, right? It's like when you have a novel adapted into a movie, right? People are going to compare the adaptation of Harry Potter to from the movie to the book because it's a one-to-one adaptation of that book with the same name, same characters, all that, right? So, to me, I think the best adaptations in the canon of EU stuff is to take concepts, to take characters, to take beats, and put them into the story you're trying to tell for canon. And if you take the name, okay, I think it's better, and especially in today's Star Wars fandom climate, it's better to not use the name like Heir to the Empire because now you're more inviting one-to-one comparison. It's better to not use the names that like Dawn of the Jedi or New Jedi Order because now you're inviting comparison. But to take those ideas and morph them into what fits your story, um, I think is a smart thing that they should do when you have a bunch of source material. My preferred thing would be to also get those exact adaptations, one-to-one adaptations on film or an animation, uh, in some type of alternate timeline.
yeah, I mean, I agree with a lot of that. I think no matter what, even like what Liam's idea of like adapting an entirely new like EU timeline, new EU. that kind of streamlines things and all that. It's just the nature of fandom today. Someone probably would hate that too, but yeah,
Sure.
I truly believe that would have been better than, just a one-to-one like some fans would claim. Because are we really gonna go with an 8th Imperial Section remnant that another source book has to be some guy has to be, like, grabbing his hair in the late '90s and be like, "How many are they here, and how do I make this whole work while still valuing stuff like Thrawn and all that," right? Especially when a lot of the earlier even '90s era was already playing around with the idea of, like, there's different tiers to the canonicity of these stories, and it's just interpretations of, like, ideas and things that are pretty similar, like, just like comic books are, and how do other creatives kinda take it and run with that, right? So, I will always appreciate canon for being a little bit more unified. Clearly, it's not 100% in keeping things in line, like, a lot of talk these days is more of, like, these are stories that are passed around, and they aren't necessarily one-to-one always, which that's fine. I just would like to avoid a lot of those issues that seem to be cropping up with our CCO that is Filoni, who is commonly the one making a lot of these retcons and changes. I'd like it to be more so of, like, the interpretations of Cobb Vanth, where in the interludes of Aftermath, you get to see a lot more of a darker, twisted character that is trying to do right by his town, by his Freetown and all that, but in The Mandalorian, he kinda tells his version of the story. I'd like it kind of done more in universe, more so than, like, the real world that we have, and I think that would kinda be the same problem, and that same positive of, like, doing an adaptation of the EU that, you could have some interpretations and some things that are, like, kinda told were just people how they were wanting to tell the story, but would everyone really love that? No, nobody ever really loves everything. There's always gonna be someone that dislikes it, right? So, we're not trying to limit that here in our live or anything, it's just that's just how we look at it.
Well, we only have about 20 minutes left in our stream tonight, guys. So we want to get through as many of these questions as possible. There were a bunch of other news stories that we wanted to go through. I think I'm just going to read them down for y'all in case you're interested. And then maybe next week, if it's a slower news week, we'll go more so into them than we will right now. But to start off the bat, and then we'll get back to your guys' questions. So again, about 20 minutes left in the stream. If you want to make sure you get a question on and you're way at the bottom, very sorry about that. If you want to send in a super chat, support the channel and it will get your chat on no matter what. We will take all super chats before the stream ends, regardless of time. If not, we're going to keep running them down from top to bottom. And if you're also liking or watching the video and you haven't liked, please like the video. So to start off with, we have Star Wars Outlaws, which has been nominated for a couple things at the Game Awards. It has been nominated for Best Action Adventure game, which is not too surprising. That this year has honestly been a pretty darn weak year for video games overall. A lot, kind of a top heavy year. Some big surprises. Astrobot was a massive surprise. Most of the things that were really high profile this year, not too many things lived up to the hype. So, uh, not to take the honor away from Star Wars Outlaws, but it has been nominated for some game awards, which is great. And hopefully it continues to improve because we also have reports that big changes are coming to Outlaws starting November 21st. This is a story we talked about a couple weeks ago as well. Um, they were saying that internally they're working to try to improve the game, especially prior to this first DLC pack. And then also this timeline, November 21st, it lines up perfectly being a couple days away from now, but a week before Black Friday, right? So, what I've been saying the whole time since our very first review is that I think Ubisoft, they massively discount their games every Black Friday. 50%, sometimes more, sometimes 75%, 80% off. And so I think right now they've accepted that Outlaws is going to be a sunk cost, but where they could make money is people buying the game to buy DLC. So at this point, they're trying to improve it to get those people who either have already purchased the game for full price and are willing to come back for DLC to come back because of new features, or to get people who might not have wanted to pay full price but are willing to take the risk as either a Christmas present or just a Black Friday purchase or whatever. They're trying to make this game as good as for them as possible so they keep playing and eventually buy the DLC if they want to. So we're going to get a bunch of new features. They're going to add the ability to hold on to weapons when climbing and traversing the environment or interacting with enemies and the world. This is a big one for me. It should be extremely obvious. And if you haven't played Outlaws, you're like, what? What does that mean? Yeah. So basically, you couldn't hold on to weapons you picked up on the ground. Kay has her
Oh,
blast.
yeah.
She has a blaster pistol, and she uses that the whole game. That's your primary weapon. But the game also gives you the ability to pick up a variety of different weapons from Imperials to different crime factions. But if you tried to climb a ladder or something that most people could do with one hand and hold the weapon in the other hand, Kay couldn't. She had to drop it to climb it or jump. She couldn't do that. So they've added that back into the game. They added a shoulder swap button so you can swap different directions with shooting. Animations and reliability of using cover should be improved. That's good. Tweaks have been made to make headshots more rewarding. There will be stat changes to weapons and enemy types to make them more distinct. That's also a very big one because the game, part of the replayability of the game to me was the fact that there's so few upgradable things and stat changes that it makes, trying to push through to get new upgrades rather pointless. It's more cosmetic than anything. Enemies now have weak points as well, so you can easily take them out with a precision shot. New defeat animations and hit reactions have been added. Recoil fire rate and ammo accuracy have been updated to improve weapon feel for every gun, including improved feedback for audio, VFX, and UI. The Ashika clan ABR2 Zato blaster rifle will get a new shooting pattern for a more unique gameplay style, and they will add more uses for K's pistol, with the power module able to destroy cover and the ion module being able to stun enemies for longer and let them take more damage. So those are all the different things they're adding in to Star Wars Outlaws to try to improve the game's overall quality. As you might have noticed, they're gameplay improvements. They're not necessarily content additions. I was telling Sanak earlier, I would really love at some point here soon some type of free content additions. It doesn't need to be a full-fledged DLC, and I don't expect any of the DLC to end up being free ever. It's not like this game was such disaster that they've got to now backtrack like Battlefront 2 and give us free stuff. But it would be nice for people who have finished most of the stuff that's interesting to do post game in the base game to at least have a couple of things that make it a little bit more worthwhile. Maybe some tweaks to the contract system that make you not just rise and fall between factions, but also help you get money that improves certain parts of your character or different things that aren't just cosmetic or aren't just superficially helpful. Different things that would help improve post game. I would love just minor tweaks to the formula, minor upgrades to the open world that would allow for people who don't want to buy the DLC to actually come back to this game. And then, hey, if I come back to the game for those things and the DLC is there and I'm like, well, I'm having fun playing this game again, maybe I'll pick up the DLC, then I might pick up the DLC. For right now, I really don't plan on picking the DLC up at all, at least not for a paid price, maybe for a membership, like a whatever it is, $15 a month or whatever that Ubisoft Pro membership is. So yeah, those are the different things coming for Star Wars Outlaws. We also had the skeleton crew directors revealed for each episode, and this is a big one. We have episode 1's being directed by series showrunner and co-writer John Watts, who most of you probably know from the Spider-Man trilogy in the MCU. He is directing the first episode. David Lowery is directing episodes 2 and 3. The Daniels, which are the biggest names on here, and also I was going to bring up a story, a different part of the stream, but I don't think I'm going to bring it up now, about the roundtable video they just posted today, where a bunch of the writers, or the two writers and showrunners with a couple of the directors, talk about the show. For the most part, it's a lot of just talking about the vibe and the way they created the show. But they did reveal in that they hired the Daniels before Everything Everywhere All at Once released and before they became Oscar-winning directors and all that. So it's kind of a happy accident that they got on this show. But they're directing episode 4. Jake Schreier directing episode 5, Bryce Dallas Howard episode 6, Lee Isaac Chung, who has directed some episodes in Mandalorian season 3 and is also the director of the Academy Award film Minari is directing episode 7, and then John Watts returns to direct the finale. So, with those two stories, Seneca, I'm going to pass it to you. Obviously, the Outlaws changes are there, and then the director reveals for Skeleton Crew. What stood out to you about those two stories?
I mean, that there's investment into Outlaws, like, they've been talking about it, the community managers and all that, but it's nice to actually be seeing it. A lot of the big, like, Star Wars video game accounts have been really positive about the game in general, but they're like, "It's missing stuff." It's like the bones are there, and that's what we've been saying in our reviews. The bones are there. Are they gonna actually flesh it out and make that holiday game now that Assassin's Creed Shadows has been yeah, it's become a big, like, whole thing about, like, "Okay, we gotta rework it," especially after the Ghost of Tsushima sequel announcement and everything, so yeah. Yeah, it's kinda crazy. It's nice to see, like, games not being abandoned and for, like, a year before they really start getting worked on again. Um, Again, this should have been there from the start. That's without denying it. It was very silly for you to be dropping the gun. Like, I understand, like, when you're maybe crawling through the air vents and sewers or something, but not, like, climbing up hills on holding on to ropes and all that. Like, no one needs to be a Kyle Katarn where they got, like, too many guns on them. You're like, "How much is this guy packing?" Right? That no one's saying go back to that. That's very arcadey. But yeah, make it, like, reasonable that Kay as a smuggler that's really resourceful, that has a data spike in her hair and all that, doesn't find ingenious ways to, like, carry multiple things, right? So, excited for that. I'm excited for the enemies to get, like, variety in how they get can be shot and their weaknesses and where they're stronger. That'll make combat naturally better. Um, I'm excited to see what comes next for sure. But I mean, yeah, Wildcard DLC, I'm gonna be picking it up because I'm been using Ubisoft Plus. I did it for 1 month, canceled it after I finished the main game. I'm excited to kinda go back and see how everything's been tweaked, 'cause I've been saving a lot of the expert missions and all that, so you'll see some walkthrough/let's plays on our channels, specifically on Wildcard. Maybe like a short review somewhere on how we think the story, how it's progressed for Kay and what's going on Lando and everything else, for Wildcard. Yes, I know, Brandon, you mentioned that there's gonna be the Hananaka one. I think it's called, um, Last Hunt or something like that, or yeah, I'm not exactly sure what the name is here. But yeah, Onaka being back is gonna be awesome because we don't really know what, like, he's doing and, like, what's going on with him. Yeah, Pirate's Fortune, sorry. That one that one I'm really excited for because, I mean, he's been a character in Rebels, but it is a caricature intentionally so. I never loved it, I just love the dynamic with him and Ezra, so I'm very curious to see how they're gonna get him close closer to the animatronic that we see in Batuu. His design has obviously been more updated in that range too, so I don't know what, like, that'll look like. Maybe there's, like, some Skeleton Crew-ish tie-ins with, like, locations and stuff. I'd love to see that for sure. I think this game story-wise will become something really rich. I think with the 2 DLCs, is it gonna be worth the price? No, but like Liam said, Black Friday deals, a lot of these Star Wars accounts are getting, like, codes through EA that they can give to people who, like their videos and all that, so that's a great way to pick it up, and if you don't wanna do that, buy the game, just do Ubisoft Plus for the same experience. Cancel when you don't want it. You'll pay basically the same price as the full game by the time you're probably done with, 2 DLCs. But hopefully, like Liam said, 3 DLCs are coming. I'm excited for that. I still haven't seen the clip that they released for Skeleton Crew. I've been seeing a lot of the TV promos, and honestly, those have been getting me really hyped. I know I haven't seen the roundtable either, but, again, that list I saw, that was exciting. I love that talent behind it. I think the direction of this, just from, like, the 5 seconds I saw of the release clip, looked really good to me. Like, I was like, "This is" they seem like they've got a really strong grasp on how to, like, direct these younger actors and work with Jude Law, and, they've really been pushing that Jude Law has been, like, almost like a mentor figure for them. I think he's gonna be allowed to, like, not just be that, but also bring out the Jude Law-isms where he's always, like, kinda snivelly, and there's something a little off about that guy. And I love when he gets to play a little bit more evil or gray, and I think we've already seen hints of that, especially since not the Force. Is he a Jedi? Is he not? Like, there's something really interesting about this story for him. But Yeah, I mean, the hype is building for me. We're not that far away. What is it, 2.5 weeks really? So,
Yeah,
yeah,
right around
I'm
the corner.
excited for both, Outlaws and Skeleton Crew. I think we can have a really fun end of the year for sure.
I hope so. I hope so. Yeah, one of the interesting things, and I didn't really even think about it, put two and two together, that they said in the roundtable was that they really did credit Kathleen Kennedy a lot with helping create the vibe for the show because she was one of the producers or one of the assistants for Steven Spielberg, like his personal assistant on a lot of his early '80s movies, and then produced a lot of his later efforts. And so she knows and has lived and breathed the Amblin formula for her whole life. It's one of the things that made her super successful as a producer. And it's one of the ways she got to know George Lucas so well when he picked her to be his successor. So, yeah, it's interesting. And it was interesting hearing all of them talk. We'll go over that more next week if it's slow news week next week. But yeah, just wanted to make sure we mentioned some of that. Brandon asked why wasn't Cameron Monaghan given a nomination for best performance for Jedi Survivor? I wanted to double check, but he was. It just was for last year because the came out in 2023. But he didn't win. It was Neil Newborn for Baldur's Gate 3, which won everything last year. So that's not too much of a surprise, but he did get a nomination last year.
I
And
think
then,
Kimberly for who played Kay Best, she got a nomination for, like, best mocap performance or something at the Game Awards,
yeah, I'm
something
not
like
sure.
that, so,
It's got nominated for three. Yeah,
yeah.
best performance. She got nominated for best performance, and
Yeah.
then also best innovation in accessibility, which
I
uh,
don't know, I guess we don't really use accessibility features. Maybe it's been really great for, like, people who are colorblind or deaf or hard of hearing or something, so
yeah,
it's been great for you and you're someone on our channel that's been able to, like, experience the game a little differently. That's awesome.
yeah. So there's that, and Brandon also says with Black Friday coming up, I would get a PS5 depending on if it's on sale, so that I can play both Jedi Survivor and Indiana Jones: and The Great Circle. Be careful though, because I'm not sure. I think Indiana Jones, unless I'm mistaken, is an Xbox exclusive, or at least off the bat, because it is a Bethesda game and they're owned by um, Xbox now. Let me double check that for you before I send you in the wrong direction, because PS5 is superior to Xbox
Yeah,
Series
you're
X,
right.
but
It's December for Xbox and Windows, and
yeah,
then Q1, Q2 for PlayStation 5, so timed exclusive, basically.
yeah, and that's kind of where Xbox. There was a story today about Phil Spencer, the guy who's in charge of Xbox. For those of you who don't know, saying that they're considering porting a lot of Xbox exclusive to PlayStation. The console wars have pretty much been over. I'm not really on one side or the other. I do prefer PlayStation and especially their products in the last 10 years or so, but I was a big Xbox 360 guy. I did really enjoy that console and I've owned every Xbox. But the console war is pretty much over. PlayStation's won by a landslide in most of these, and they're so much more popular in the number one gaming market in the world, which is Japan, than Xbox. So Xbox is making a lot of changes. I know when they bought Bethesda, the idea was for every Bethesda game to be an exclusive.
Yeah.
But doesn't seem like that's happening anymore. Just console exclusivity is pretty much disappearing. I think these companies, I find it really frustrating as a consumer, because you're like, I'm purchasing this console to have exclusive things. Why buy,
Yeah.
two? Um, but it is disappearing, and at least those at least console exclusives are coming to PC within a year or so too. So that type of exclusivity is disappearing. But yeah, I guess PlayStation's not bringing God of War and stuff to Xbox, so there's still that exclusivity if you're interested in that there. But yeah, back up to your guys' questions. That went a little longer than expected, so I go a little bit longer to try to get through more of these questions because, gosh, we're really behind on these ones today. A lot of questions today. So I believe we start with Brandon again, who says, fourth question for Dawn of the Jedi movie, what era do you think James Mangold will use outside Skywalker saga? I'm kind of confused by what you're asking because Dawn of the Jedi and Legends is its own era, and it takes place like 15,000 years. or 18,000 years before the Old Republic. So it is far, far, far in the future
Yeah.
from anything, and it's not connected to the Skywalker saga. So I would imagine it's its own thing. I don't necessarily think right off the bat with Dawn of the Jedi we're going to get a date and be like, yes, this is 100,000 years before the Skywalker saga. I don't think they're going to date it or something. I think it's just going to be a story that's like a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. This took place uh, hundreds of years or thousands of years before, just kind of a safe bet, right? And then later, as they start to iron out maybe the Old Republic, because I've always made the argument that I think the two eras should be a little bit more connected. I don't necessarily buy the innovations and things you see, the Rakatan Empire and all those different things that you see in Dawn of the Jedi being 15,000 years more or more ahead of old Knights of the Old Republic. So, and especially ahead of Tales of the Jedi, which looks even more ancient than Dawn of the Jedi did. So I think they need to condense and figure all that out. But yeah, it's should be its own unique era.
See, I don't necessarily agree that, like, Rakatan couldn't be more advanced than Tales of the Jedi. I do agree that Tales to KOTOR shouldn't feel like 1,000, 3,000 years jump, that even though it's a squished 30 and practically ignored outside of some cosmetics. Because I think you can have to some degree, you can have, like, almost like the Tolkien kind of idea of, like, civilization just progressively gets worse, gets away from the power of it all, the beauty of it all, and, like, the power scaling of it all, I guess, if we're talking in the Star Wars universe. So, I don't mind the Infinite Empire. It really does feel like the Infinite Empire because there's no real counter to it, right? And then once things become a little bit more spread out, someone gets a little bit more, someone discovers something, it kinda evens out the scales. I don't mind that, plus the concept of, like, the dark ages, like we've seen in real world history, right? Where you can have a part of the world still advancing and then the rest be like wiped out and fall behind because they didn't really have internet or like connectivity at that point. So I don't mind it, but I guess I am still confused on your question in general because if you mean like, oh, let's pull from an entirely new, like, source and hints that have been there that but aren't really explored in the Dawn of the Jedi novel, yeah, maybe that is what they're trying to go for. Because if you, like, read just the Dawn of the Jedi comics, you're not even really sure where it starts because the Yotor have already arrived and they already got their temples established and all that, so and it kinda is like that for most of the Dawn of the Jedi novels, so are you saying, like, are they gonna do, like, a mini era before what's there in the Dawn of the Jedi book where it's, like, things are kinda underway already? I don't know, but I would assume that it would be the discovery as it's been kinda hinted with the log line, so it would have to be even more primitive than what we see there. But what does the technology look like? Are they like our world, but they just happen to discover the Force one day, and then they turn into this where it's like ups and downs are so volatile because of the Force and the power that shifts and changes and causes empires to rise and fall within 30, 40 years after conquering the galaxy? I don't know. I think that is a pretty interesting place. I don't know exactly how they wanna shape the look of it. Is it gonna be Tales of the Jedi inspired where everything feels archaic, or is it gonna be super modern looking and then it gave away for 2,000, 3,000 years before coming back to the prequels? Or is it something entirely new? Don't know.
Well, I think we're going to have time for about maybe one to two more questions, depending on how fast we answer them. So, again, last call. If you want to make sure you get your comment or question or your thought on today's stream, again, we will be back next week, 7:30 Pacific time, as always, where you can bring your questions back. Was running a little bit behind today, so I didn't get to post the room until about an hour before. But hopefully next week I'll post it a little bit earlier so you can get your questions in as early as you want. But yeah, the last chance, if you want to make sure you get a question on, a super chat is your way to do it. Moving to Critical Thinker here, who says, what are your thoughts on the Giffen, De Mateus, and McGuire Justice League International? I've only read a part of it. I've read the first omnibus. I actually have the second omnibus on the shelf, just haven't read it. It was a COVID purchase and still have not gotten to it. But I did enjoy it. It's certainly a different take. It's fun, it's different, it's interesting, and it uses a lot of characters that aren't usually a part of Justice League. Certainly kind of a basis for Justice League Unlimited, which we saw, was an excellent TV show. But Giffen is a talented writer. There's, I mean, just for the scene where Batman punches Guy Gardner alone, That's awesome. So yeah, I really enjoyed the series. It's not my favorite Justice League run, but from most of what we were getting from Justice League post the initial runs in the 60s and then the 70s stuff, which I have a big soft spot for the 70s Justice League. Justice League in the 80s wasn't that great. And then Justice League in the early 90s wasn't that great. So what we were getting in international, it was certainly a breath of fresh air before Morrison came and gave us the definitive Justice League. And I think that honestly, that whole run, not just Morrison, but Morrison and Wade, Wade might have a better run than Morrison. It's so good, Tower of Babel. But then, yeah, to carry that over, and then the people who finished it, all of it was solid. Even at the end, was really solid. And I actually think the next bit was pretty solid too. The Meltzer stuff, transporting into I got to look over at my shelf. Yeah, McDuffie, that stuff was pretty solid too. But yeah, international certainly an underrated line. So definitely enjoyed
Yeah, what he said, so that's awesome.
that. Okay, I saw at the bottom. Yeah, Critical Thinker says agreed. Giffen is a legend. And then Brandon Tran said, I sent in 12 questions. One of them was if the holiday special is bad. Yes, it is bad. I think, you can enjoy it ironically because of how bad it is. I just think, unfortunately, for the holiday special, one of the things that makes it even hard to enjoy as a so bad it's good is the fact that it's super duper boring. So even for the funny scenes, it's hard to get between those connective sequences. Next one is Critical Thinker says, what Legends characters would you guys want to see most in a hypothetical Rogue Squadron movie? And yeah, right now it is hypothetical, unfortunately. Besides Wedge and Corrin. This is a good question and one that definitely connects to a lot of topics on the channel since we just finished the 3 Wraith Squadron book reviews, and we actually have recorded our 4 Rogue Squadron reviews that should be sprinkling out on the channel here in the next couple weeks. And then we are going to be doing our live for Legends Book Club, and I know a lot of you have been asking that on the stream. So let me go back to the calendar to remember which day it was. We're going to be doing December 11th. So I'm about to make I meant to make a room last week, so you guys can already start and put it on your calendars and see it. But I'll make one tonight, a live room, so you guys can see that it's coming up. And yeah, plan on it. If you've read Rogue Squadron, I would say come if you haven't, but we are going to talk spoilers. You're welcome to come still if you don't care about spoilers. We'd love to have you. You can ask your questions about the series. But if you've read Rogue Squadron, specifically the first 4 books, we'll be talking about that on December 11th. And then stay tuned for the reviews. But yeah, as for the characters from Rogue Squadron I'd like to see, I mean, I think the main ones, Mirax, Tycho. I think Tycho especially is foundational to Rogue Squadron. I'd very much so like to see Tycho. And I would like to see Oral and Gavin. uh, and who else? Noir Aven. I think that's most of who I would like to see. That's pretty much everybody that's main important. But yeah, that's those are the ones I'd like to see from Rogue Squadron, specifically, not Wraith Squadron.
I guess I would like to see Pash Kraken,
Yeah,
because I think
that'd be
he's a
one.
character that just doesn't get any service in those books, even though I think he's got one of the more intriguing backstories, especially with his connections and all that. And the whole concept of the squad is like, yes, they were like fight or die, do whatever it takes to survive during the rebellion era. But once they return to that New Republic squad, it becomes a lot more political, like appointments, like who comes in and all that. So yeah, I mean, he probably had one of the more interesting, like internal political choices, but ultimately a very personal choice of like, am I still that fighter after this many years, or am I just becoming used to my way of doing things, right? And he wanted to test it, and I thought that was really cool. But he's basically MIA for like a book and a half in between his first appearance, so that always bummed me out. um, Errol Nub, I think she's a cousin or something of Nine Nub, so I'd go I think that's what the Rogue Squadron movie series or whatever they do, you can kinda push the characters that have to be there, like a Gavin and all that, but you can also, like, expand a little bit more on these plots, especially I'm blanking on her name, but, like, Gavin's, Bothan girlfriend too. I think that would
Yeah.
be pretty interesting. A seer, I think. Um,
Yeah. Asir
yeah.
Sylar.
So I'd like to see that, especially if it's a series. I think that's where those characters would shine. In a movie, you'd have to again focus on a Tycho, a Gavin, stuff like that.
Wedge and Corin. Yeah. Yeah. I think a critical thinker says Tycho, West, Hobby, Oral, Nawara, and Gavin. Outside of the pilots, Mirax, Booster, and Ayala. Yeah, Booster for sure. If you bring in Mirax, you got to do
You
Booster.
can't have Booster.
And then Ayala is a great character as well. I'd like to see her. Um, and then yeah, if you include some comic stuff, Soon Tyrfell and Plur, yeah, that all that stuff would be great. I would love it if they did Wraith. Like if they wanted to make this a full series and they wanted to start with just the first season being Wedge, Tycho, Wes, Hobby, um, and some of the others. You could do Zeps and Eska if it was pre Empire Strikes Back. You could do you could do a lot of fun things with the early Rogue Squadron, and then do the end of the comics, and then first book, second season, where you bring in Corrin, you bring in all those other characters, and morph it into Wraith, and then you would already have Wes set up because he's such a big character in Wraith Squadron. So yeah, that would all be really cool. And then I think this will be our last question. Again, sorry everybody, we didn't get through all of them. A lot of questions tonight. We really appreciate that. Make sure you save your questions, bring them back next week, unless you'd like to send them in right now via super chat. So we will answer that for sure. But if not, I think we're going to close out tonight with Brandon, who says, fifth question. If Jango Fett Bounty Hunter game was remade into canon as a new Disney Plus show called Journal of Jango, then what would you want to see happen? Well, I think the plot of Bounty Hunter is honestly really solid all around. So if they just
Yeah.
adapted the plot, I think that would be fine. Maybe what they could do is, instead of doing the origins of Asajj Ventress's lightsaber, you could do just kind of the Asajj origin story in the same show and get rid of the original origins for her lightsabers. But I think it should be heavily focused on Dooku and Jango. Now, that's what makes it a little more difficult, is that not just that Tamora Morrison doesn't look like Django as much anymore, but Christopher Lee obviously passed away, and he's kind of irreplaceable. Like he is kind of like Peter Cushing, where it's like, do you CGI him? What do you do with the Christopher Lee? So that would be tough. I think you could get away with it if he was just in holograms, but I would really love to see even more Dooku in that story if you did it as a TV show. But yeah, I mean, I think you could pretty much just adapt the game because the game story is really solid. It's the gameplay that kind of stinks about that game and hasn't aged well.
Oh boy. Yeah, I mean the whole camera angle debacle of the original. I heard it's been fixed a little bit more with that remaster. So, yeah, and I mean Komori Vosa is super interesting. She is the original wielder of the curved double lightsabers that, or not dual lightsabers that Asajj has, and that ties really well into O3. And that's a fun connection. I feel like is still missing in canon that she's kind of given that she doesn't really make those. But we'll see. We'll see what happens. I I I think more importantly, we need to see open season, and because that's been
Yeah.
really hinted at with like the Mando civil wars that are kind of going on, and now we got the whole flare of the intrigue behind Bo-Katan and her father now, right? And obviously, how does that his survival, eventual death probably lead into Satine's rise, and then her being on the run and all that, being protected by Qui-Gon and all that. Like that's a huge story for the Mandalorians I want to see happen. I hope that's what a Mando season 4 could have focused on with Bo-Katan kind of like connecting all the histories of the wars and all that stuff, and then realizing, okay, Boba is a little bit more than meets the eye compared to most clones and all that. Um, and while still giving her plenty of action, of course. But yeah, I don't know, man. I that the best I can say is that it's a cool idea. It's a good story that could have been a great miniseries. I hope we get something animated or like a comic adaptation into canon.
Well, I think that's going to have to wrap up our stream tonight. We went a little longer than usual, but thank you so much for joining. As always, a lot of good news to talk about today, a lot of great comments here to discuss. So thanks so much for sending them in. Again, if you didn't get yours on, because there's still so many comments we didn't get through, make sure you save them, bring them back for next week. I know, Brandon, you said you had 12 questions, save them. the ones we didn't get to, the other 7, and then we will get to them next week. So thank you so much for watching this week's stream. Again, make sure you like the video if you haven't. If you're new and you're watching on replay or you just joined us tonight for the first time, subscribe. We do this every single week, 7:30 p.m. Pacific time. We have noticed that a lot of people are showing up a little later than 7:30. Let us know if you want it a little bit later of a stream, or if you guys are just finding us later, because we want to make sure as many people as possible get to enjoy these live streams. So make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel for more. Check out all the other great content we have on the channel. More videos coming here soon. A lot of great stuff coming here in the future. I know somebody did ask about the Skeleton Crew characters video that I usually do, where I predict characters will be in the next show. That will be coming out either end of this week or beginning of next week. I'm working on that one right now. So stay tuned for that. We have shorts every other day, community polls twice a day, every day, asking you who's your favorite Star Wars character. So check that out. Make sure you vote in that if you haven't. Check out a lot of our other great content that's been on the channel. Thank you so much for watching this week's stream, and we will see you guys all next week. Good.